Welcome to Scary Stories. We got a very special for you today. Our 13 most popular stories ever, going back to the beginning of our channel. These are all Dogman stories except for one. Well, you'll find out when you get to it. But the other 12 are Dogman stories. Let's start with number 13 and head all the way down to number 1. This one should set the tone. An awful lot of these are about friendly dogmen. So let's get started. Dogman is my friend. Dear Scary Stories NYC. You know how long a Mississippi dogman can live? At least 55 years, I'll tell you that much. I know that they're real. I know that they're intelligent. I know that they're loyal. And I know that they remember human faces or scents, or maybe both. To be clear before I go any further into my narrative, you should not go up to an adult or even adolescent dogman and expect a friendly interaction. I don't want anyone hearing my story and becoming careless around wild animals. Yes, the dogman is my friend, but it happened by accident. And it happened when we were both a lot younger. So I want to say this was 1967, but it might have been 68. Things changed so much each year back then that I can usually remember when things happened based on my clothes or what music I was listening to. This was summer camp though, which I only got sent to in 67 and 68, and it was virtually the same thing both years. One of those 2 years someone found a puppy that liked to stand up on its hind legs and dance around. It had a weird looking face, kinda had a chin, which is not a very canine facial feature. It made its face taller and looked kind of a little human. To some of the kids, that made it a freak, so they started throwing rocks at it and hurting the poor thing. I rescued him and hid him away so I could nurse him back to health with the help of one of the camp counselors. He surprised us both by being better pretty much the next day, as I remember it. He could walk on all fours fine, but he seemed to prefer standing and dancing around on his hind legs. That was why one of the adults nicknamed him Nureyev, after the famous ballet dancer from back then, Rudolf Nureyev. That weird little dog kept on surprising us by disappearing when we were looking for him, and showing up again when we least expected it. He seemed to be an excellent hunter, bringing small game back with him to camp each time we saw him. He also seemed surprisingly bigger each time as well. When the last day of camp came, Nureyev was nowhere to be seen, and so I said goodbye to him in my head, never expecting to see him again. I moved out to the West Coast when I got done with high school, and by the later 70s, I drove back to Mississippi on my Harley Davidson. I was in my 20s and feeling rebellious, but also I was going home to ask to borrow some money from my dad. On the way there, I got sidetracked and delayed by these 3 badass guys on these little Japanese bikes. I wouldn't exactly call 3 guys a gang, but I was alone, and they were ordering me to hand over my cash at knife point. Like I said, I was driving home to ask to borrow money, so the amount I had on me was not enough to satiate these cranky dudes. I don't know what they were on, man, but they started freaking out and threatening to do away with me just because I didn't have enough cash. I saw my life flash in front of my eyes, for real. I saw my whole life story, and it was a stupid one with a bad ending. But then, out of the woods, comes this sound, like a dog mated with a lion or something. This sort of canine version of a roar, you know? Nothing like anything I'd ever heard before. And so everybody just stops. And we all freeze, looking around with our eyes. And then, bam, out of the woods comes crashing Rudolf Nureyev, but now fully grown up. He had the same coloring. He had the same ears on top of his head. And he had that same big chin. But now, he was ripped and bulked out with muscle. He looked more like a human than some kind of an animal. Like, have you ever seen when they draw Tony the Tiger to look all buff like an athlete. Well, imagine that in dog or wolf form. You've got what I was seeing. The bikers buzzed off like gnats, and this big 6.5-foot tall muscle man covered in dog fur leaped on top of me. We both slammed to the ground, and I figured I was about to have my face bitten clean off. But no, Nureyev wanted to lick my face, not eat it. He still remembered me. I have to say, if we knew he'd grow up to look like Charles Atlas, we might have named him Steve Reeves instead of Rudolph Nureyev. It was a fantastic reunion, and one of the most amazing memories in my aging head. The way it ended, though, was somewhat alarming, I guess. A police car pulled over to ask me if I was all right, and the Dogman started growling. Then he chased them back into their vehicle and chased the cop car down the road and out of my sight. Nureyev might have saved my life, but that didn't mean he was tame. He was a wild and dangerous animal, just one that happened to remember that I was one of his best personal allies. So over the years, the stories I just told you got repeated to 2 additional generations of our family. It became our personal legend, and we figured it was all in the past. How long could a canine live anyway? Even an upright walking one? Well, in very late August of 2021, my daughter and granddaughter were driving me home from the hospital. The weather was very bad, and we were worried that we might not get home at all if we didn't get ahead of this weather. Well, out onto the road, in the middle of the rain, walked Rudolph freaking Nureyev. If anything, he looked even more muscular than before. It's possible his fur might have been going gray, but it was soaking wet in that moment. He really looked like he had not changed in over 40 years. He was so big, and he successfully blocked the road, not allowing us to pass. We looked at him, and he looked at us. And then, after just about 2 minutes, he ran off and was gone. My granddaughter was not happy. The sighting had shaken her up a great deal, and my daughter was trying to console her, while also trying to drive in the rain of what turned out to be Hurricane Ida. When we approached a bridge up ahead, we were stopped at the very last second by emergency personnel. It seemed that the bridge was not actually there any longer. It was impossible to see that from our angle, and my daughter would have driven out into the abyss. We could actually see cars stacked on top of each other, off in front of us, underneath where the bridge once was. If we had arrived a minute or 2 earlier, nobody would have been there to warn us. We would have been one of those cars with people trapped in them, and some of them even passed away that night. We might not have made it. We might have been casualties. But we weren't, because we got a visit from Rudolph Nureyev, the Dogman. And as I've been trying to tell you all through this, the Dogman is my friend. My neighbors are werewolves. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I would not have long to live if I told you the location of my home, or my werewolf neighbors. They're very nice people, but they would have to terminate me if I betrayed their location. I know this because the mother of the family told me so when I attended a barbecue over their place this past July 4th. By the way, she makes the best barbecue. I usually found that to be a talent of family patriarchs, not matriarchs. But in that family, the father prefers his meat raw. So you would probably never guess that the female is even a werewolf, at least not at first glance. She looks human to me. When I first saw her, before I met her, I figured she was a Wiccan, but I was wrong. She did eventually tell me the name of her system or religion or whatever it is. I had never heard that word before though, and so I've forgotten what it's called. It's not Satanism or any religion I'd heard of. It seems to be something only werewolves, like that family, even know about. As for her husband, that guy looks like your standard werewolf type, complete with the unibrow and the fleas. He's constantly scratching himself and panting. I find it hard to stay in his direct presence for too long. For one thing, he's got dog breath. They have 2 pups, but I don't really know if they're boys or girls. I've only seen them in human form. But their eyes are grayish, minty, greenish blue, and seem very alien. Both have long hair, and names that could be either boy or girl names. Besides being a family of werewolves, the parents are quite bohemian. I met the father in a kind of a rough manner. It took my wife and me 2 days to move into our new home nearby the werewolf family. Even after all that, we had left some stuff back at the old place, so I went back with the car to grab up any remaining items that might be of use to us where we were moving to. On the way back, when the highway spilled off into our new neighborhood, a big 6.5-foot guy with a dog head covered in animal fur ran out of some bushes and directly into my car on the driver's side, ricocheting off like a character in an old silent comedy. Trust me though, I was not laughing. I thought I'd just run into a human being and I stopped the car. As I sprang out to look for him, I was scared of how badly he might be hurt. But I have to say, I was equally as scared of the fact that a guy wearing animal pelts and a dog head might be dangerously insane. I could be trying to help him, while he might be trying to do the opposite to me. Still, I didn't see how I had a choice in the matter, so I called out to the man, asking if he needed help. Then I stepped gingerly off the road onto the soft and muddy ground, leading to the woods alongside the street. Once I stepped under the trees, I was amazed how the sounds changed and the lighting changed. It got colder, and everything smelled differently too. It smelled like the earth, I guess. It had been raining recently, and so the world in there was moist and humid, and somehow very different from what I'd been expecting. I didn't see the man though, injured or not. After a bit more searching, I started to feel stupid, and I went back to the car, where I saw that the guy had actually put a dent in my door when he ran into me. That must have really hurt, but I couldn't find him, so I figured I'd better get on my phone and introduce myself to the local police. This wasn't really the way I wanted them to first learn about me, but it would have been wrong not to report the incident. I was raised to never lie to the police, and I felt an obligation to be honest. As I was about to dial the cops on my cell, out of those same woods ran that very same crazy guy, wearing the dog head mask. Only this time, it didn't really look like a mask at all. I could see him more clearly than last time, but I could tell it was the same guy by his height and the furry animal pelts. Only this time it looked more like it was his own fur. It looked like this was not a human wearing a costume, but some kind of a dog-headed creature that ran upright like a human. I dove into the car, locking the doors. I felt like that beast was coming for me, and that it was going to bite my head right off my shoulders. As I covered my head and braced myself behind the steering wheel, the canine-headed creature leaped, not at my door or window, but instead up onto the front hood of my car, making sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard with its long dog nails, and then over the car and off into the woods on the other side of the road. I was about to hit the gas and get out of there when I realized I had dropped my cell phone outside when that werewolf-looking dog-head monster thing ran out of the woods toward me. Believe me, it took a lot to get me out of that car to get my phone back. I was seriously pricing it in my head. What would a new cell cost? Would I be willing to pay that much to avoid having to get out of the car again on that evening? I thought of the Dogman racing back out of the trees and taking me down, and I was leaning toward leaving the cell in the road. But then I thought of how angry my wife would be if I did that, and I decided that having her mad at me was probably worse than getting eaten alive by the Dogman. At any rate, I got the phone, and it was a scary drive home. I was looking over both shoulders at once, and my hands were shaking. When I saw our new house in the distance, I felt a sense of relief which instantly vanished when I saw that big, ugly Dogman sitting, like a canine, right on my front steps. When it saw my car approaching, the thing stood up on its hind legs and made a sound. Something like a howl, something like a yip, and something like a growl all at the same time. I slammed on the brakes. That thing knew where I lived. Had it done anything to my wife? The creature bolted from where it was, leaping from the top of the stairs to ground level in one jump. He ran off in the direction of the backyard of our neighbors, and I knew at once I had to warn them. Although I had seen them, we had not officially met each other yet, and it seemed our first conversation was going to have to be about the werewolf that I accidentally attracted into our neighborhood. My phone rang, and it was my wife, who was inside the house and safe. I urged her to lock the place up and stay indoors, and that I would explain why later. Jogging to the front door of the neighbor's house, I was distracted by the sight of our female neighbor inside one of the front windows. I had seen her from one of our second-story windows before. She was big-boned, and she wore long dresses. This was part of why I thought she was a Wiccan from first glance. From what I could tell through the window, she was casting a spell, using a knife and a brass cup, which are used in Wicca. There were other items and symbols around that I did not recognize at all, though.
"Do you like what you see?"
Came a deep voice from behind me. I turned around fast and stood up, somehow managing to bang loudly into the window I had been spying through. I looked upward into the blue eyes of the unibrow guy I had told you about before. It seemed he had just walked up around the house from the back. His wife was now out in front of the house too, and both of them stood there glaring at me, with their mouths hanging open at my sheer gall. I tried to regain control of the situation. I had come there to warn them, not to spy on them. I tried to tell them that there was a dog-headed werewolf who just ran into their backyard, but I stuttered, and I don't really remember how much of my intended message got through. Both of them started laughing at me, which made me defensively try again and again to explain that they might be in danger from a werewolf. The big man with a deep voice asked me,
"Hey, mister, can you tell me? Did the big bad monster look like this?"
And then bam, I wasn't looking at a human being any longer. He became a hideous, terrifying-looking dog-faced mongrel man. And then, just as quickly, he returned to his unibrow human form. Only now he was making a deliberately stupid face in order to mock what the expression on my stunned face must have been in that moment. I noticed that the wife had a fur sleeve on her arm, which seemed confusing to me since it was a warm day. I did a double take when I realized that was her own fur, growing out of her arm, but only on her arm. She looked embarrassed and folded her arms over each other, trying to cover the fur patch. "Sometimes it doesn't all go away with the sunrise," she said shyly. These two didn't need protection from the werewolf. They were the werewolf. I felt like I was going to faint. I had moved my wife and myself into a very dangerous situation, and now I didn't know what to do. The two of them had a good laugh at my expense. Then we all sat down, and they explained to me the way it was gonna be. They are very well-connected people, and although I would not call them rich, They are able to do a lot more favors than your average neighbor. I won't get into it, for obvious reasons. They told me that moving in next to them was like hitting the jackpot. But, like in other windfalls and lottery triumphs, there are certain costs that need to be paid. For one thing, we maintain radio silence on the unique abilities and lifestyles of our neighbors. Secondly, we visit them when we are invited, and we never speak to them at all when not contacted. Third, we respect all contacts they introduce us to, as we would respect them. And finally, if my wife becomes pregnant, we are to inform them before anyone else, even our own family. This is the only subject we are to contact them about without an invitation. If we are expecting a baby, then our neighbors will use their connections to find us a new home in a different part of the state. It took a while to get the reasoning for this out of them, but it seems that while in werewolf form, they are unable to resist the taste of recent human offspring, so it would become too dangerous to be there at that point in time. So it's a little nerve-wracking living next to a werewolf family. I mean, we don't feel comfortable inviting either of our own families out here. At least we know that this won't last forever, and that we'd, at least in theory, be assisted into moving into a nicer, larger house. Things could be worse, I suppose, but I don't think I'll ever get used to the fact that my neighbors are werewolves. The Midway Marvel. Dogman in Tennessee. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I've got a true Dogman story for you. It's just a short little one, but it was the single most incredible thing that ever happened to me. My brother was with me when it happened, but he's no longer with us to tell his side of the story. I'll attempt to relate my memories of the encounter with as much accuracy as I can muster in tribute to my late brother, as it is his story as well as mine. If there are mistakes in the telling, I beg both you and he to forgive the atrophying mind of an old man, which is what I've grown into and become. This was the scariest thing I ever saw, true, but it was also the most incredible and miraculous. Some people have a sense of wonder at the world after a visitation from what they perceive to be the Virgin Mary. Well, with due respect to the Mother of our Lord and with no sacrilege intended, I have a similar sense of sheer wonder that goes back to the night that I saw this inexplicable beast man. He could have easily snuffed my life out in that brief encounter, but because he didn't, I know that every moment I'm still breathing is the most wonderful gift that any man, woman, or child could ever be given. If you're not from around these parts, Midway, Tennessee is located in Hawkins County. That's on the northern edge of Tennessee, just south of Virginia, and about 100 miles west of the North Carolina border. If you look at a topographical map, you can see that Midway is located in a valley in the midst of those same mountain ridge lines that extend all the way north into Pennsylvania. And along those ridges and valleys, people have been seeing strange and wonderful, impossible things since time immemorial. I'm not just talking about the Dogman, and I'm not just talking about all different kinds of the Sasquatch people either. I also mean ghost lights, UFOs, even pterodactyls and giant-sized thunderbirds. It's led all sorts of people smarter than me toward all sorts of guesses about how this could be. Are these mountains and valleys really a time vortex area? Are we looking into prehistoric times when we see these oddities? Or are prehistoric creatures able to slip through into our world due to the unique qualities of the geology or landscape? Is there something different about the gravity or magnetism of mountains and ridges that can play with the very nature of time itself? Or is there something even wilder at work in these places? All I know is that growing up where I did, I felt a deep sense of wonder and amazement at the entire world, and I still to this day wake up each morning knowing that literally anything is possible on every single day. And a huge reason for that sense of wonder stems from the fact that I survived my encounter with the Midway Marvel, or the Dogman of Midway. We do have some patches of woods around here, but not ones large enough to sustain a creature such as what I saw. The Cherokee National Forest is only about 30 or 40 miles away as a bird flies, though, so that's my guess as to where this beast might have wandered away from. You know, sometimes an animal can get kicked out of a clan due to the limited number of females to breed with, or he may just choose to strike out on his own. The sad truth for his species is that now there are plenty of areas it may not be safe for someone like him to wander out into. Don't get me wrong, I'm not starting to feel sorry for monsters. If one comes charging at me, I'm still gonna defend myself, even if that means using lethal force. Even so, I can still feel empathy for another fellow out looking for a family. I think we all can. After all, if you get done in by a dogman, there's a good chance he only did it because he was hungry. Or maybe he was as scared of you as you were of him. And speaking of being scared, I was never so scared in my life as I was on that night, when I was face to face with that glowing-eyed, spooky, mysterious monster. My brother and I were 13 and 14 years old at the time, and we didn't call him the Midway Monster. We called him the Midway Marvel. He was a wonder to behold. He was the strangest natural creature I ever expect to see in my remaining years on this miraculous planet that we all share. So on this particular night, my brother we can call Jay and I were walking home from playing in the woods on the southeast section of town. I remember we were walking down Huff Road, leading up to that path cut through the woods that leads up to Midway Road. As you walk down Huff Road in that direction, there's spooky forest on your right, but there are nice houses on your left. It was dinner time and you could see the house lights on, and you didn't feel any sense of danger. We felt perfectly safe, and I'm sure we were joking around in our usual manner back then. I don't recall exactly what we were talking about, but I remember the sharp change of mood on my brother's face when we reached that right turn, leading straight through the woods, back to the main part of town. It's not a narrow little path through the woods, it's a very straight, clear-cut, wide path that they made years earlier so that they could string the phone and electricity lines through there into town. I don't know when it was done, but obviously not that far back in time. It didn't look scary or feel scary to me, but my brother, he sensed something that I couldn't. I could tell he didn't want to go in there, and I don't think either of us knew why. We always took that shortcut, and we gone through there later in the evening than it was on that day. So why would my older brother suddenly be afraid of something we had done casually so many times before? I asked him if he was all right, and he just basically told me to shut up. He was so afraid that he was afraid to admit how afraid he was. Do you know what I mean? But at the same time, he had no logical reason to be nervous, so he manned up, and the two of us entered those dark woods on that warm summer evening. The going was slow as the grass and weeds and bushes were overgrown. There wasn't really a need to prune them, as that area wasn't intended to be used as a pathway. It was just cleared to make space to put in the telephone poles. Then the forest was, I suppose, granted free rein over the area if it chose to grow up again all around it. For this reason, it was easier to cut through there in the autumn and spring, but I enjoyed doing it most in the summer. You would see all different kinds of bugs and moths and butterflies in there, and I loved bugs well into my teenage years. My mother forbade us to go through that clear cut after she picked a tick off me one time, but we kept doing it anyway, as it was what we loved to do. Except on that night, Jay was having a hard time of it. He seemed more nervous than I'd ever seen him. Normally I was the timid one and he was brave. Having him act like that seemed kind of funny to me, and I was cracking jokes at his expense, which did not make him calm down any. Finally, I just came out and asked him, "Can you please give me one good reason why you should be acting so nervous?" Then, as though the forest itself were answering my question, there came a loud crack from behind us that caused us both to jump in the air in shock. Turning around, we saw the main character in this story. Standing there on two legs, bigger than big, was a huge man with a dog head holding a thick tree branch in his hand. The branch had green leaves on it. This was not a dried out old thing. It was a thick, healthy, living tree branch, and this giant was holding it in his hand like it was a tennis racket. When I say it was a man, I don't mean a guy in a tracksuit or jeans. I mean it stood on two legs and it had two arms that ended in hands. That was the extent of it resembling a human, though. It wore no clothing for starters. It had a head like one of those Egyptian paintings of the dog-headed god people, but the fur was not as deep black as all that. This guy had brown fur, very dark brown fur, and it covered most of his body in a thick fashion, with it thinnest on his lower belly and the sides of his long canine snout. The skin underneath appeared a dull gray where it showed through. I don't recall if the fur was all entirely one shade or not, but it was dark out and I just may not have noticed. I know that even in the dim evening light, it still gave off eye shine, especially when you weren't looking directly at it. Its white claws on its very humanoid hands nearly glowed in the dark, and when it curled its lips back to show us its long gritted teeth, I could see those quite clearly as well. Why had this monster man broken that branch off? Why did it jump out behind us and not in front? It seemed to be threatening us. So why threaten us from behind? What I mean is, I could understand a predator threatening us from the front, and I could understand if he snuck up on us from behind. But why make such a loud display trying to frighten us from the rear? While we stood there frozen in our tracks, trying to understand the message that the hairy giant was communicating to us, it added an exclamation mark to the end of its figurative sentence. The creature bent down a little to be a slight bit more in our face, and then it screamed at us. It was like a bark, and also like a roar, whatever you want to call it. We interpreted it as him telling us to get out. It was sort of like the Dogman version of screaming, "Get off my lawn," to the annoying neighbor kids. We did what we thought we were being asked to do, which is to run out of that clear cut to finish our journey back to civilization in the form of Midway Road. Jay tripped and fell repeatedly, as his nervousness had been proven valid. He told me later that he was certain that dog-headed monster was going to run him down and finish him off. I had no such premonition, so I just ran. Then I waited for Jay once I reached Midway Road. I stood there looking back, and I saw the bright red face of Jay with tears streaming down his 14-year-old cheeks. Behind him, I saw that Dogman, still holding the branch, still standing in the same exact spot, and still clearly wanting us to go away. When we got home, it was obvious to the family that Jay was not his normal self. At least to my sister and my father it was. My mother was watching some kind of primetime soap opera and kept telling us to be quiet. I asked Jay if I could tell the story, and he nodded yes. Every time he tried to explain, his voice would crack up and he would start shaking all over again. With me, though, I had been through a scare, but I hadn't felt as though the Dogman were out to terminate us the way Jay had thought. I was frightened and shaken up, but I was also amazed by the creature. That's kinda how the family fell into calling it the Midway Marvel, because I was the one who first described it to them. To me, it was a miracle. A scary miracle, but still a miracle. Nobody ever told me that a dog could have hands and walk bipedally. And on the other hand, nobody ever told me that a man could have a dog head. Always, in our schools, they taught us about nature as though they already knew everything that there was to know about it. It was that experience with the Dogman that showed me that school books are important to read, but they're only starting points for learning about the world. It was on that night that I stopped caring what so-called experts say about anything, because an expert is really just a human school book. He or she may know an awful lot about what has been discovered up to that point, but he or she does not know any more than you do about what might be discovered starting today. I never stopped listening to my teachers, and I never stopped listening to the so-called news. It's just that I stopped believing them, and I just consider what they tell me to be one opinion in a sea of many. And that was a lesson taught to me by nature, which is the greatest teacher of all. Nature, that is, speaking through one of its most enigmatic offspring. The Midway Marvel. Don't go anywhere, we got another Dogman story in a second, but first, ladies and gentlemen, it's our honor to reintroduce Mr. Greg Connor. To become a channel member won't cost an arm and a leg. If you don't believe us, then just ask Greg. Please join us in thanking Greg Connor for making this episode possible. In return, we share with him our weekly secret uncensored stories far too wild to run on this channel. Did you know you can join for only 99 cents a month? You won't get access to our 21 hours of archived videos, and you won't get to view our shows in advance like some of those at higher levels. But the 99-cent level or the $1.50 level at peterbernard.com will allow you to see our Sunday secret stories available nowhere else. Our spokesdog, Henry Lee Dogman, will be along at the end of this show to explain it all in more detail. But now, let's jump into our next Dogman story, which we call I Saw a Wounded Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a teenager, my friend and I stumbled into a cave in the woods and discovered a dogman that seemed to be about to pass away. It was clearly still alive, but it seemed weak, and I'm not sure it even noticed we were there. This was a long time ago. I guess maybe it happened in the late 80s or early 90s. We lived in Tennessee at the time, near Gatlinburg, which is not too far north of the Great Smoky Mountains National Forest. My childhood buddy, whose name I forget, so let's call him Carl, and I were messing around in the woods and discovered the cave entrance behind some tall bushes completely by accident. We, of course, went right inside, as boys will do, and in the dim lighting inside there, we saw this big, hairy beast laying on his back. He didn't look comfortable, as though he were sleeping. He looked more like he had fallen backwards into his position. We could see his chest heaving up and down, so we knew he was alive, but the wheezing sound he was making did not give us the impression that he was healthy at all. In fact, he sounded a lot like my grandfather had when they hooked him up to life support equipment just before he left us for the next world. The creature's apparent state of incapacity gave us the nerve to circle around him a bit and get a better view of what we were seeing. Mind you, we never got any closer than maybe 15 or 20 feet away, and we were always prepared to slip away should he sit up or present any other kind of threat to us. This was a gray, furry creature, like a wolf, but much larger. It laid on its back the way a human would. It was not curled into a circle or in any other position that I would associate with the way various animals lay down. It did not resemble a bear, but it was at least as large as one. The animal had a dog-like head, or a wolf-like head I should probably say. Yet its chest and arms were more like those of a very big man. I think it had man-like legs too, but covered with thick gray fur. It was hard to tell what he might look like if he had the strength to stand, because as it laid there, I have to admit, it looked somewhat deflated. This poor creature had seen better days, and it looked like it was not long for this world. I remember being torn between wondering if we were in danger being where we were, and wondering if there might be something we should be doing to help this creature out. We didn't feel confident enough to get any closer, though, and we didn't know what, if anything, we could do to help it. So I suggested we go get my father and lead him back to that cave with us. Carl accepted this idea as we were closer to my house than to his, and so off we went back to see my parents. I remember we dropped M&Ms on the ground as we left the woods, hoping that would help us find our way back. Mom was against the idea, but Daddy was curious, so he armed himself and told us to lead him back into the forest to find this cave we were talking about. Well, we hardly saw any of our candies on the ground. Maybe squirrels or something grabbed them up, but we did find the cave entrance, and we all climbed back inside. There was no Dogman inside that cave. Carl and I ran over to the spot where it had been laying, and we insisted that we weren't lying. We couldn't find any blood or any evidence at all that anything had been there, but my daddy believed us anyway because he had raised me to be honest. We asked him if maybe we should wander deeper into the cave to try to find the creature. After all, in his condition, he couldn't have gone too far. My father thought about it, then shook his head no. There's 3 ways I think this might have gone, he told us. The first one is that the dog-headed beast found himself a spot where he thinks he can defend himself. A wounded or sick beast is a dangerous one, and we wouldn't want to get ambushed by him whether he was sick or not. The second possibility is that he's part of a social species, in which case some of his brothers may have come in and carried him off. In that case, we'd never find him in a million years. The third possibility in my mind is that he crawled off someplace to die, as animals tend to do. In any of those 3 cases, I believe we owe him the respect of allowing him to pass on in peace. You need to always treat others as you would want them to treat you boys. That's the most important rule of the Bible, and the most important lesson you can learn in life. So we left that cave, never to find out what happened to the Dogman. And yet, my father made sure we knew that there are some things more important than satisfying your own curiosity, such as showing respect and behaving with honor. And if the spirit of that creature can hear this, I thank him for allowing us to see him in those brief moments, so that we all grew up knowing that there are more things in this world than will ever be included in even the most up-to-date science website. No matter how much we learn, we'll never do much more than scratch the surface in terms of understanding this remarkable blue marble spinning around the sun. The Dogman and all the mystery cryptids out there help remind the human race to stay humble. For that, we owe them a debt of thanks and a constant showing of respect. Those are the lessons I learned on the day when I saw a wounded Dogman. The Slithering Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a nightmarish encounter with the Dogman on a hiking trail in Minnesota, although I'm not going to mention which one. This creature did not walk on its hind legs. In fact, it crouched down very low to the ground, like an alligator, and it sort of moved in an S shape, not unlike the way a snake does. I had been sitting and napping, leaning on a tree the other night, one of the last warm days we're probably going to get this year. A cold breeze came and woke me up, and it's a good thing it did, too, as slithering right up to me was this nasty-looking hairy Dogman, but it was flat down low to the ground, like a gator. Its arms were out to the side and bent in, like it thought that I wouldn't be able to see it if it kept low or something. I screamed and ran out of there, and the thing slithered along after me. It was not really going very fast. This was not a dogman that could run as fast as a car, as I've heard you talk about. I saw a crowd of people up ahead, and so I ran toward them. When I could take a chance to look behind me, I would see that hideous beast slithering along on the ground after me, and I just kept running toward the crowd. I had assumed the small crowd of people would frighten the beast off, but instead, it dove right toward them, biting at people's legs, causing a chaotic tumult. Everyone was screaming like it was the movie Jaws as I ran away from that horrible scene and into my car. I called the police as I drove out of there toward my home, telling them that some rabid dog was attacking people at the location I was leaving. By the time I got home, it was dark out, and I was ready for bed. In fact, I was even going to skip dinner and just crash. When I got out of the car, though, the crash came from the bushes near my garbage cans. Out of the darkness slithered that flat-to-the-ground dogman, growling like it was planning on taking some kind of revenge on me. I ran around the house to the front steps, and I slipped, banging my face hard into the stairs. I gave myself a bloody nose, and my vision was impaired for a while. But I somehow got up those stairs and got the key into the lock. I was turning the key and opening the door when the dogman leaped onto my back, and the two of us tumbled into the front of the house. I was nearly blind with pain, and although I got up and away from the beastman, I banged into plants and stepped on a cat and fell sideways into the next room, onto the floor. I knew I had to get away, but I didn't think it was realistically going to happen. Everything was going black when I heard a big explosion and a yelping canine. When I came to, I was in the back seat of my elderly dad's car, being driven to the emergency room. He had pulled his old hunting rifle off the wall and loaded it up in the time I was banging into half the house and falling down. He told me the thing stood up, and he hit it dead on, causing it to back out of the house. He thought it was over and done with, but the beast just sort of stood back up, roared at him, and then walked off in a cranky way. My dad didn't think that he was any more hurt than if he'd been hit with a pea shooter. That's how strong that creepy, slithering monster thing was. My daddy told me the thing was looking like it was gonna try the slithering dogman. Nate does. So he felt he had to take him out. Now, I don't know if that's actually true, because some of the things my daddy says are sort of a little bit strange. I don't mean he's crazy or anything, but maybe just a little bit imaginative. God love him, though. If it weren't for that old man, I might not have survived my encounter with. Number 3. Is this a hodag in the snow? Dear Scary Stories NYC. My nephew from Wisconsin claimed he took this photo a day or two ago when he got stuck in a snowstorm while hiking not far from Waukesha. This is just to the southeast of the Lapham Peak Observation Tower. Apparently it really did snow, and his parents really were concerned when he was late getting home in the storm. But as for the rest of the story, none of us can really say as to whether it's real or not. The kid is known to pull pranks, so if this is real, he's sort of the boy who cried wolf one too many times. Still, he was in Wisconsin, and that is where the hodag is known to live, at least according to legend. The thing is, those legends are not supposed to be real. The hodag is supposed to be a local story that's kept alive to entertain children and tourists. It's not supposed to be an actual beast that you might bump into in the night. Assuming this photo is real, and admittedly that would be a huge assumption, this creature is pretty flippin' large. Look, my nephew does not have Photoshop, but he does have one of those other art programs for the computer where you can touch up photos. Maybe he took a picture of some dark rocks and they look like a monster with the snow swirling around. Still, it's been a day and the kid hasn't changed his story so far. I don't know. What do you think? Could this be a hodag? Could it be any living thing at all? Is it a trick of light and shadow? An optical illusion? Or will the hodag have the last laugh on all the rest of us by turning out to have been real all along? After all, what better survival strategy can any creature in the woods have than to convince the human beings that you never even existed in the first place? Maybe the hodag will turn out to be the smartest living thing in Wisconsin. At any rate, with my tongue firmly in my cheek and my respect to whoever or whatever created this image, I'll leave it up to you to decide. Is this a hodag in the snow? Everyone loves dear Kathy B. That's the way it's supposed to be. She's cool and likes to have some fun. She's our sweet Kathy Barrickman. What a surprise to see a super chat donation from our own Kathy Barrickman earlier today. Kathy, you don't need to do things like that. We still thank you on each and every new story. We hope you're feeling better and that you can stay on a nice long good luck streak. You're a brave and determined person that we all love and are rooting for. Thank you for your donation. That crazy Dogman picked a fight with me. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I recently saw two young-looking dogmen walking along the edge of my property. When I was investigating the area, one of the two creatures, who each stood as tall as I do, charged me. This is my true story of how I managed to live through the event. I don't believe it myself, so feel free to call me a liar. If you told this story to me, I wouldn't believe you either. I live in the Great Lakes region, but I don't want to get any more specific about it than that. I live in an area without many trees, where in a lot of places you can see for miles. It would seem to be an unlikely place to find creatures like dogmen living, since there doesn't seem like there would be enough cover for them, especially when it's still light out. Nevertheless, I was walking our property toward the small grove at the back, which marks the back end of our land. I guess it's probably about 18 to 21 or 22 trees by this point, the closest thing to a forest, within walking distance. Often, as I approach it, I can hear the sound of birds in the trees. But on that particular day, all I could hear was the wind and the sound of my own footsteps. Something felt weird, but I'm not the kind of person to allow a strange feeling to change my plans. I don't know if I disbelieve in psychic impressions, but I would prefer to exert my conscious control rather than allow superstitions and subconscious notions to frighten me back to bed. In other words, the more my gut told me that something was wrong, and the more my heart beat too fast, the more determined I became to finish checking out the woods before I finished the rest of my chores. If you don't monitor that little grove, all manner of creatures can make a home that I might not want on my property. Better to nip things in the bud, chase the hornets out before they've finished building their nest, as it were. Let me ask you, have you ever found it hard to breathe and felt your chest tightening up just because you were getting scared? Me neither, except that was what was happening in that moment. I had to finally stop, take a few slow, deep breaths, then look around for a minute. And I mean look around, as in 360 degrees. Everything seemed normal. Everything was mellow. It was a beautiful sunset coming to a close, and about to head on into what promised to be a lovely late summer, early autumn night. So why wasn't I even hearing the sound of crickets, let alone birds? That should have been enough for me to put off the inspection of those trees for another day. But I'm Taurus the bull, so I took another deep breath, and then I resumed walking toward the grove. It sounded like a dog was screaming at me as the leaves in front of me shook and parted. I mean, I guess you could call it a dog screaming, or maybe a man barking, take your pick. But it was an inarticulate and intense expression of anger and indignation, coming from what sounded like a mouth very much like that of a wolf, or maybe a jackal. I looked and saw the silhouette of a man emerging from those trees, and my first thought was that this was an insane lunatic who was about to do away with me in my own backyard. I turned to run and heard growling behind me. Inhuman growling. When I looked behind this time, I saw the canine mouth that was making those sounds, and I saw the human silhouette, now fully lit, but still colored dark black, because it was covered in short fur. I was getting a little bit more information with each glance, but it was like I was seeing two different things. When I could hear the creature yelp in pain and stop chasing me, I turned to watch the craziest spectacle I am ever gonna see. There were two of these creatures, and they were both men and canines at the same time. They were upright, like men, bipedal, like men, and they had hands like men, or, well, like monsters anyway. In many other ways, they resembled black wolves, sleek and agile, athletic, unlike anything a human could ever hope to attain. They were my height, around 6 feet, and from what I've read since that evening, I'd guess that these were young adults, maybe brothers. It seems most reports in my region of the country these days have creatures larger than 6 feet. So what was happening was that the one Dogman was holding the other one back, trying to prevent him from attacking me. One wanted to destroy me for some reason, and the other was trying to prevent this from happening. The angry one escaped and ran toward me, and I screamed and tried to get back to the house. Our property is rectangular shaped, and I was running across it the long way. Unlike the property, I am not in the shape I was before the pandemic, so I did my best to get back before I collapsed, or before the Dogman caught me. The two creatures looked like twins, and the only way I could tell the difference was by their behavior. I watched them fight one time as I was out of breath, leaning on my knees and trying to slow my heart down enough that I could run some more toward the house. When the angry dog broke away this time, I just sat down on the ground, panting heavily, and waiting for him to come get me. At the very last second, that other one grabbed the lunatic Dogman, and I realized I'd been granted one final chance for survival. I wearily leaned on the knee of the beast that wanted to bash my skull in, and pushed myself back up to a standing position. It lunged at me while I was close, and there was one moment when I was pushing him back, while his twin was pulling him from the other side. If that other Dogman was willing to go to such efforts to save my life, I needed to at least try to get back to the house. And so I ran again, this time unsure where my strength to continue was even coming from. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me, and the next thing I remember was waking up sometime later with a bruise on the back of my head from where I fell when I fainted. It took me a minute to remember what had happened, and when I did and looked for the monster Dogman, I couldn't see them anywhere. Every one of my family and friends know this story. I've become a Dogman maniac in the months since this happened. They all know that if they approach those trees behind my house and they don't hear birds or crickets, that they better turn around and retreat. And if they don't do that, then they might find themselves the next poor soul crying out into the night. That crazy Dogman picked a fight with me.
I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
Dogman versus 15-foot Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had an adventure that was directly inspired by one of your earlier shows, at least in a sense. You told of some people who camped out near a mystery spot in Montana, I think, who then had a Dogman experience. We have our own mystery spot near Lake Michigan, within a couple hours driving distance from where I live. So I tried to talk all my friends, any of my friends, into going camping with me up there in those woods to see what cryptids we might find. They were all busy working jobs that they hadn't been able to work due to the medical situation, so everyone was too busy working to go goof off with me. I ended up going to the mystery spot alone, and I almost got myself crushed out of existence during the epic battle between Dogman and the 15-foot Bigfoot. I took the Mackinac Bridge north, ready to begin my adventure. When I got there, I parked my car near the mystery spot and then walked over there, sizing the place up, but not getting the tour, which I planned to do the following day. Then, I wandered off into the woods to find a secret place to camp. There's a pretty nice-sized forest over there, and you can sometimes see some cool animals, too. It's across the water from an island where the St. Helena Island Nature Preserve is located, and past that, on the opposite shore of the mainland, is Wilderness State Park, plus the Headlands International Dark Sky Park. You simply don't know what you might run into in northern Michigan, and I looked forward to the kinds of dreams that might come that night. Well, I didn't get to sleep at all that night. In fact, I didn't get to sleep until I was in the hospital the next day, due to the real-life waking nightmare that I'm about to relate to you. I was eating my dinner in front of my campfire just a little past dusk, when the night was beginning to grow completely dark. I heard a crashing through some trees, and I heard a blood-curdling scream that started off sounding like a woman, and ended up deeper than the deepest voice of the largest man. I never heard anything like that before in my life, and I bounced to my feet, utterly surprised, not understanding what was happening. Through the woods pushed a creature that was actually taller than some of the trees, moving them out of the way like a punk making his way to the front of the crowd to see his favorite band. I have no idea if that'll mean anything to you if you're reading this in the future after crowds are permanently banned for our health, quote-unquote. Let's just say he unceremoniously and abruptly inserted himself into my life with no warning. This was an upright ape man, like a chimpanzee with Bigfoot-sized feet, who had excellent posture, standing up straight and tall like Superman, even though he appeared to be an ape and not a man at all. I suppose this was Bigfoot, but it was a very anthropoid-looking one. I mean, the face was all monkey and not human at all in any way. It did not have monkey or ape feet. It had big, wide Bigfoot feet. So, I'm going to call it a Sasquatch of some kind. Whatever he was, he marched across the short field and showed no fear of my campfire whatsoever. Whatever he was, he marched across that short field and showed no fear of my campfire whatsoever. Reaching out one ridiculously long simian arm, he grabbed me around the torso with just one of his giant hands, and he lifted me up to his face, screaming at me the way my mother used to do when I would talk back to her. My entire body was the size of this Bigfoot's face. Can you imagine being pulled through the air into a face as big as you? He could swallow me in one gulp, two at the most. I tried to break free, but his one hand was stronger than my entire body. The only other time I felt that powerless was the time I got handcuffed, but that's a story for a different time. I was certain I was done for. The Bigfoot was opening its mouth so far to scream that I could see part of the way down its throat. This was an end-of-the-world nightmare for me. And then, as suddenly as he had started, the ape-man stopped screaming at me and stared at me quizzically. He began sniffing me all over, opening his hand a little bit to allow himself access to smell my torso, my midsection, and my legs. He looked at me with a confused expression, then smelled me all over again. I had no idea what was going on at that moment, but he seemed to be thinking. It looked like the biological computers inside this guy's brain were doing calculations. Whatever he decided, I sensed he was no longer angry at me. Holding me close to his chest, the great beast began running at what seemed like great speed away from my campfire and through the forest. My face and my left ear were pressed to his massive rib cage, and I got a good whiff of Bigfoot's sweat as we ran. I could hear his heart beating madly in his chest, as well as his giant lungs doing the breathing of 3 men all at once. I could not see where we were going. I could only make out a blur of green whizzing by as we tore through the forest, moving forward at insane speeds. When we stopped, I was placed up high in a tree where I clung onto the trunk for dear life. I am not a tree climber, and I discovered in that part of all this that I do in fact have a fear of heights. I was maybe only 35-40 feet up, but I couldn't figure out how to get down. There was only one set of branches beneath me, and then a drop that was taller than the Sasquatch. If he was 15 feet, then I would probably have had to drop 20 or 25 feet to the ground, even if I made it down to those branches beneath me before I jumped. Then, I started looking upward at the branches above me, wondering if I could climb higher and get away from the Bigfoot that way. Even looking up made my head spin and my vision spiral. I wasn't sure I could succeed in climbing higher, and at best, it would only be a temporary solution. I was so consumed with fear and so shaken up that it took all my concentration just to hold my position in that tree. I was not viewing escape as something feasible to attempt. I was pure quivering jelly. I was a mess. I was defeated. I was fully immersed in cowardice. And I was that giant Sasquatch's captive. Enter Dogman. I don't know exactly how this happened because I was up in that tree, focused on my own situation and contemplating how to escape. But suddenly the Bigfoot crashed into the tree below me, almost knocking me loose and causing me to fall. As I clung on for dear life, I saw that he hadn't lost his balance. He had been pushed into the tree via an attack from another hairy creature. The Bigfoot charged forward away from the tree to return the favor, and I strained to get into a position where I could see this fight better. I carefully squatted down on my branch and tore some leaf-filled twiggy branches out of my line of vision, giving me a better view of the small clearing my tree was set at the edge of. And that is when I understood for the first time that I was looking at a North American upright walking canine, more commonly known as a dogman. As I watched this creature bark and snarl and bare his long, prehistoric-looking fang-like teeth at the much taller Sasquatch, I rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't confused about what I was seeing. No, that was a dog-headed ape-man. It was not a smaller Sasquatch. It was also not a bear. Most of my friends have told me that I saw a bear, and some of them won't even talk to me anymore because I won't agree with them. I'll tell you the same thing I told them. Bears aren't gray. They're brown or they're black. If you're way up north, then maybe they're white or blondish, but they don't come in gray. Wolves come in gray, and this thing was some sort of wolf that stood up on its hind legs. Now certain of what I was seeing, I was still completely confused as to why these two giants were fighting, or what they were fighting over. My body froze in fear, wondering if they were fighting over custody of me. It was a little hard for me to judge height while staring almost straight down at this battle, but the Dogman seemed to be about half the size of the Bigfoot. If the Squatch was 15 feet, then maybe the Dogman was something like 7. He definitely padded around on dog paw feet, but I don't want to say that they were small feet. Small compared to the Bigfoot, sure, but they call them big feet for a reason. The werewolf or man-wolf had paws larger than those of your average dog. For some reason I could not explain, these two alpha males were engaging in a most serious battle. Each of them appeared ready to terminate the other one, if that was what it took to win. The dog sounded insanely furious, and it was clear that the ape man didn't like the Dogman very much either. They both sounded like monsters, ready to destroy. They both seemed to accept that this might be the battle that might end their story for good. This might be the fight that their entire life had led up to, and which they would never be able to walk away from. The 15-foot-tall Bigfoot had his hands balled up into fists, or something very much like a human fist, and he hauled off and clocked that Dogman in the jaw, knocking the beast clear off his back legs and into some foliage. The blow would have crushed me. I didn't think I would have ever recovered from that, and I assumed that the Bigfoot had just ended this fight in the first round. To my surprise, the Dogman wasn't only still alive, he was still in the fight. Running out of the bushes and circling around behind the Bigfoot, the bipedal canine leaped up in the air and onto the Sasquatch back, digging his claws in and eliciting squealing, pained shouting from the ape-like monster. The Bigfoot lurched forward, trying to throw the Dogman over his shoulder, but those claws were dug too deep in his flesh to let go. The Bigfoot screamed so loud that it hurt my ears, and it flailed about almost as if it were on fire. Then it fell backward, crunching that Dogman between him and the ground. Standing up again, the Dogman had been knocked almost unconscious by the unexpected attack, but his long, sharp claws were embedded so deeply in the Bigfoot that he hung there like dead weight, creating an even more painful situation for the giant ape man. He spun in circles, trying to reach behind him and dislodge the canine monster, but he could not reach it, even with his extra long arms. Whatever he did only caused himself more pain. Spinning around madly, insanely, painfully out of control, the huge Sasquatch, quite by accident, slammed the Dogman sideways into a tree, and the canine came loose and fell to the ground. He appeared quite winded and kept shaking his head as though trying to shake off whatever damage the Sasquatch had just caused. As the bellowing, furious Bigfoot charged forward with clenched fists, the Dogman recovered in time to stand in a defensive position and flail his arms wildly in front of him, his claws out. The Bigfoot attempted to land punches while the Dogman defended by swinging his open-clawed attack, trying to slice those fists before they could do damage. As I watched from the tree, I wondered which of the two beasts I actually wanted to see win this fight. I got myself upset all over again with the answer I heard in my head and my heart, which was, I don't want to see either of these monsters win. In neither case would the win be good for me in any way. No matter which of them won, I was the loser. For this reason, bravery began to grow inside me about revisiting my thinking concerning trying to escape from this situation in some way. Immediately, I maneuvered my body while holding onto my branch so that I could drop down, hanging underneath the thick branch, holding on with my two hands and attempting to swing to the lower branch and drop down onto that. Again, this would only bring me 10 feet closer to the grass below, but it would satisfy my need to do something. I couldn't stand by and do nothing any longer. Ignoring what was happening between the Dogman and the Bigfoot, I swung myself back and forth, and then I let go, hoping the momentum would carry me to where I wanted to go. I was pretty surprised when my feet landed exactly where I wanted them to, directly on top of the branch I aimed for. I was even more surprised when they slipped off and I slipped straight down, catching myself with my two hands and my chin, which took a great deal of the brunt of it. That hurt so much that I almost passed out. I knew I had to climb up onto that branch again, but I was in so much pain that I needed to hold still and wait and endure the throbbing agony that I was experiencing. It didn't just hurt on my chin, but my neck hurt from the minor whiplash, and the back of my skull was experiencing a major headache. It was excruciating, just take my word for it. I was in blinding pain, but I didn't think I had endured any real damage. I hung on for dear life, immersed in the throbbing pain as it rose and fell. Soon, when it fell, it was almost gone, but then it ramped up again to agony equal to before. I had to continue to relax my head and face muscles while keeping my arms fully tensed around that branch to prevent any further injury. As the pain began to subside more and more, I was able to take in my surroundings a bit better. The battle between the two creatures was still raging, with the Bigfoot on offense, punching away, and the far smaller Dogman on defense, ducking down under the blows and swinging his dangerous claws wildly at the fists whenever they came close enough. I wanted to jump down, but it was a bigger drop than I'd ever experienced before in my life. I didn't know if I could do it without twisting an ankle or worse. I was never the most athletic or graceful person, and I could not envision in my mind how I could possibly come out of that drop unharmed. Nevertheless, I was going to have to get my courage up enough to try. My arms were by then hurting more than my head. I wasn't going to be able to hold on all that much longer anyway. And then, the situation was decided for me. The Dogman took advantage of a lapse in the Bigfoot's attack, and he leaped forward, this time planting his claws deep in the Bigfoot's chest and belly. The 15-foot-tall Sasquatch staggered backward, moaning a horrible sound, and his back slammed hard into my tree, dislodging me and sending me plummeting toward the hard ground below. I landed on both feet, then allowed my legs to go limp beneath me, hoping against hope that I wouldn't break every bone in them by doing so. Well, my legs were fine, but my left ankle had twisted around a bit, and once again I was in severe, shocking levels of agony. I remember looking up to see if either of the creatures noticed my fall, as my hands wrapped around my ankle, feeling for broken bones. I watched as the Bigfoot turned to see me lying on the ground, and then the Dogman plunged his teeth deep into the ape-man's throat, causing him to have to focus on his werewolf opponent instead of on me. I still was not sure if the Dogman was even aware of my presence, although I worried that he was fighting the anthropoid over me. My fear overtook my pain, and I began to crawl on all fours away from the fighting. I remember hearing the dog snarling and the Bigfoot wailing in horror and unhappiness. In my mind, that Dogman seemed to be winning, and I was filled with panic that he would chase me down and eat me up before I could get very far away. While my main goal was to get out of Dodge, I also kept my eyes open for any possible hiding spot. While looking around for a cave or some such thing, my eyes fell upon a thick stick on the forest floor that looked tall enough for me to use as a sort of cane. Leaning on a tree, I climbed back up on my legs, and using my makeshift cane, I was able to slowly and painfully walk upright away from the fighting behind me. It was about then that I heard the sound of a large canine who had just gotten hurt, and in my imagination that meant the squatch may have turned the tide. This did not calm me in the slightest, however. I was just as panicked at the idea of either of them winning. By this time, I was just hoping the fight would continue. I wanted them focused on each other, and not on me. I remember staggering out of the woods and onto a road. It must have been Martin Lake Road, and I remember flashing lights. I was told later that I had been rescued by a state trooper, but I don't actually have any memory of that part of what happened. I woke up in a hospital being rehydrated in a bed. They told me that my ankle was not seriously injured, and that if I went easy on it, I should be able to walk out of the hospital that same day. That is, if the hospital's shrink decided I was mentally stable enough to leave. Hospitals to me feel like prisons, so I got my act together and I made up some story to tell the shrink. It was a story that had no giant monsters in it, believe me. It was a story with a happy ending that I delivered in the calmest and most rational way I could manage. I made eye contact, but not too much eye contact. I smiled, but I didn't smile too much, and I was allowed to return to freedom within a few hours. Once I was out of the clutches of the authorities, though, I got on my phone and started telling all my friends what really happened. Some of them won't talk to me anymore because of this. They think I've lost my mind. That's not true, but I did almost lose my life on the day when I was forced to watch the battle of Dogman versus the 15-foot Bigfoot.
Everybody wants a wooden cat. The scary stories Beanie hat. Everybody knows it's a natural fact. The scary stories Beanie hat. Link is in this video's description if all goes according to plan. Available in black, which is like every color all at once, man.
Captive of the Dogman clan. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story to tell you that I call my life story, and my mother calls my sob story. It's the true account of how I was abducted by aquatic canine cryptids in northern Michigan. I held against my will for over 3 months, forced to eat that which the Dogman found too gross. It started off as a swim in a lake, a pond, but it ended up with me losing absolutely everything. When this all began, I was a young man who had just finished 4 years at an Ivy League school, but was still a few credits shy of graduation. I was at a crossroads and uncertain what to do. I told my mother I wanted to take a few months off to do something besides school in order to decide on my life's direction. I think that was just what she was waiting to hear from me, as it had become unfashionable among her peers to even have sons anyway. Whatever I said or did was viewed through a lens of male entitled chauvinism or whatever made-up nonsense. I was her son, the same person she had known since I came out of her, but I wasn't fashionable any longer, so my sister became the only important person in my mother's immediate family. I lost my temper and said something to her about how my life would be easier living off the grid in the forest. At least in the deep woods, nobody lectures you about third-wave feminism or whatever. I dodged a lamp flying at my head as I exited and walked straight into the woods on the back of my mother's estate. I had put my bathing suit on under my clothes because I had originally intended to visit my buddy at his backyard pool that morning. I needed to blow off steam in that moment, though, so I stormed directly through the trees to the swimming hole back there. My mother told me to call it a pond. She said swimming hole is a term that only hillbillies would use. You know, I don't even know what a hillbilly is, but maybe I am one, because I call it a swimming hole too. This pond was really a small lake, and it was a very deep one that I had never actually found the bottom of. I used to try to a few years earlier. I got a snorkel mask, and I started trying to swim all the way down, touch the bottom, and then come up. When I finally learned how to hold my breath long enough to do this, I discovered that what I thought was the bottom was just a very wet mud that shifted around in my hands when I would try to touch it. No matter how far I reached down, I could still reach further. Eventually I gave up trying to find the bottom of that swimming hole at all. For all I know, it comes out on the other side of the planet. Anyway, I didn't explore the bottom that day. I just took my outer clothes off and left them with my cell phone on shore. Then I jumped into the water, wearing my bathing suit. It was a hot day and it felt good to swim around in there. Soon I started to calm down and accept things. And it's true, in the old days, I'd have been getting all the inheritance, and I'd have been obliged to care for my sister. Now she would get all the money while publicly bad-mouthing and sabotaging me for personal characteristics that I have no say in, like my gender, and so forth. It's just the way of the world. Was it better to play it my mother's way, in exchange for a tiny inheritance? Or should I just strike out in the world on my own, and try to find people who don't hate me for what I look like, or other things I have no control over? And as I was wrapped up deeply in serious thought, something grabbed my ankle, pulling me down into the water, and making everything I had been thinking about quite irrelevant. I did struggle, but I had also breathed in some water when I had been pulled down, and I was in a bad way almost immediately. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up, coughing violently, and I remember the horrible feeling of water pouring out of my lungs. I was on some flat, rocky surface in a cooler, darker inside location. When I could finally pay attention to my surroundings, I saw that I was in a cavernous interior, with water coming up in the center of the room to the level of the ground. As I looked, I saw that I was surrounded by canines of a strange sort. Large dogs that looked sort of like wolves, but sort of not like them. I looked around for the masters of the canines, but all I saw were more canines. They couldn't be who dragged me into this place. I had been grabbed by what felt like a hand. Everyone knows that canines have paws, not hands, so I needed to find a human. And then I felt I would know what was going on. I stood up and started to walk in a random direction, exploring where I was. One of the canines shocked me to the core by getting up just as I had, on his hind legs, standing much taller than I do. And he moved to stand in front of me and block my passage. I had not really registered the canines as a threat in my somewhat traumatized state. I always liked dogs, even big ones. These didn't seem friendly though. Some more of them stood up and gathered around the one blocking me. They all looked at me with impatience and intolerance in their eyes. I backed away, and there was no conflict, but I found there were very few places I could go without getting glared at. At times there were almost 24 of these creatures in there, although some kept coming and going through the watery opening in the center of the floor, so that number kept changing. I was wondering when the owner of these weird upright standing dogs was gonna come collect his pack and explain to me what was going on. But then, at some point, the biggest of the dogmen came over to me and sorta pulled me up into a standing position roughly, using his hands. Wait, using his what? Once he got me standing, he shoved me, and then a few of us began marching through a very dark tunnel where there was no light at all. I'm afraid of the dark and I started to panic. I tried to get back out of there. Now several of them were shoving me. I kept moving forward into the pitch darkness, wanting to scream. Push, push, shove. I moved forward, not being able to see one single thing in front of me. I felt certain they were pushing me into a pit, and that I wouldn't know until I was falling into it, and it was too late to save myself. I felt like my brain was gonna explode. I don't think I ever felt that completely freaked out. The last thing I wanted to do was take another step forward into that pitch blackness, but that's what those creepy, smelly dog-like men were forcing me to do. This was the worst moment of my life, but it was gonna get a whole lot worse, trust me. So obviously they did not throw me into a pit and end my life, since I'm here writing this down for you to read. We followed that dark tunnel into a larger cavern that was dimly lit from places above me that I couldn't really make out. In this central place, which was somewhat circular part of the way around, there were caves extending deeper into the walls, and it seemed these dog people had each claimed their own sort of doghouse spot. It was sort of like a cave people village, you might say. I was brought through an area with younger dogmen, and my arrival caused a tumult. It seemed that most of the smaller dog people liked me, as they licked me all over and made happy sounds as I was brought through. I can't really explain the process, but it seemed to have been decided that I was going to be placed in a smaller cave next to a space being lived in by one of the young ones who seemed to like me and his family. The way they were treating me, I sort of felt as though I must have been chosen as the family's new pet. When I got thrown into the space next to the family's apparent home, I was stunned to find a human female in there, wearing nothing but denim cutoffs, and she was tied to a boulder with rags. I tried to speak to her, but the poor thing screamed bloody murder till they eventually took me out of there and tied me with what looked like a remnant of a human-made rope to a boulder in a different recess. I couldn't understand anything the human was saying, if she was saying anything at all. Not only was I not sure if she spoke English, I wasn't sure if she spoke any language. That pack eats meat, provided to the females, the elderly, and the young ones by a group of the younger and middle-aged bull dogmen. Men ate first, females second, kids third, and I got what the kids rejected. At first, it was too nauseating, and I fasted. Then, when I got hungry enough, I ate what they gave me, but I found I couldn't keep it down. Eventually, I started to have less of a problem with that end of it. You really can adapt to anything when survival depends on it. The alpha male dogmen would come and go as they pleased. The adult females would go on errands in the outside when necessary. But the children, the elderly dogmen, and the pet humans were kept in the cave system most of the time. So it was, I think, the third week in August when this all started, and it was warm enough down there in those caverns that I was not really uncomfortable at first. My feet were developing calluses that rivaled horseshoes in terms of hardness, but I was losing weight and I was feeling fit enough. I was beginning to learn not to panic, and it was becoming a bit of an exercise in Zen and remaining conscious in the moment. I was almost getting used to my new life. And then, after 7 or 8 days, I realized I was on the verge of forgetting to count how long I had been with them. The idea of losing touch with the human calendar terrified me, as it meant then I would be completely cut off from all human culture. I started to scratch the days in a place on my cell wall, but the next night, we were all gathered together by the alpha bulls, and we were herded through another, somewhat wider, but just as pitch black tunnel out onto the surface world, which looks so much differently now than I had remembered it. My personal handmade wall calendar was back there somewhere, and I had no idea where I was heading to next. Wherever we were, the stars were incredibly bright and easy to make out. I was really mad at myself for never studying astronomy, even in a cursory manner. I mean, can a ship's navigator tell exactly where he is just by looking at the stars? I wanted so badly to know where the heck we were walking from and to, but I have no idea. From that point forward, I also really had no guess about how many days I was in captivity. We stayed in underground locations sometimes where I couldn't tell where the illumination was coming from. The lighting in places like that would remain the same, dim, like sunrise or sunset, all day and all night. I had no sense of time in those cave systems, or whatever they were. You know, that's another thing. This guy I know was asking me recently if these were natural caves and tunnels, or if they were hand-carved, and I had to tell him that I wouldn't really know what to look for in either case. I do not remember seeing these creatures using tools. They seemed to hunt using their hands, teeth, and feet. I never saw them carving out a tunnel, so I can't tell you if that's something that they could even do. Thinking back on it, I do suppose it's rather convenient how the relatively similar living spaces were there in each succeeding location that we would go to temporarily inhabit. Is nature the world's greatest landlord? Had the Dogman created small settlements in multiple locations so that they could migrate back and forth? Or had they inherited these caverns from some earlier and now defunct people? Most likely one that used tools. I say now defunct because if the Native Americans of this area knew these remarkable underground living spaces, I'm pretty certain they'd shut out the Dogmen and send in crews to investigate and study. And then we really could answer that question about who or what created these several locations. At some point, the cave system we were staying in started to get really cold. With what looked like old rags they seemed to have found, I was always on the lookout for cloth or animal skins, or anything I could use as a blanket, or clothing. I knew I would not be able to make it through a winter in my bathing suit, but I didn't see how I could explain that to a dogman. About all I could do would be to pass away, and these wolf people would probably just think something like, humans only seem to live one season in captivity. Then they'd have the alphas catch a new one in the spring. I felt doomed, and things only got worse. The males got us together, and I assumed they were marching us south. I was hoping for Miami, personally, maybe St. Pete. Instead, we got an unidentifiable wintry forest wilderness. That's what we came out into. That weird woman and I were going to be forced to march in our bare feet in the snow. I had a feeling that was not going to work out. The girl was the first to go, and the dogmen gathered around to stare at her prone form as she turned blue. I ran away like an insane man. I ran until I couldn't feel my feet, and then I still kept running, trying to pretend that it didn't matter to me, that everything below my knees had gone numb. I don't think the dogman even followed me. I wonder how long it was before they noticed me gone. I also wonder who rescued me and brought me to the hospital, because I have no memory of that. Well, I had gotten frostbite, but they got to me in time to save every finger and toe, so I'm quite a lucky person. The pond I was abducted from is in Oscoda County, Michigan, and the woods I was rescued out of are just to the east of Hollidaysburg in PA. That's over 500 miles away according to Google Maps. It says we could have done it in 7 or 8 days if we had gone straight through, but of course we stayed in multiple locations along the way. Since it was mid-December when I woke up in the hospital, that means I was out of the loop for around 3.5 months. That's a long time to wear nothing but a bathing suit, trust me. When I opened my eyes one day in the hospital, and I saw my mother, you can imagine how happy I was. I tried to get up, But she shouted at me that I was gonna pull the thing out of the whatever and I should sit still for once in my life. I realized she had a captive audience now. She had shown up, not out of concern, not to help me get better, no. She had shown up to perform. And it was quite a show she put on, too. It didn't matter what I told her. She knew in advance that I was a liar. There was no such thing as a dogman, and if there were, it wouldn't live in her pond. I didn't walk 500 miles with a pack of dogmen. I was goofing around all that time. I was probably on drugs, and I was so stupid I forgot to put my winter clothes on, and then I ended up in the hospital. Hadn't she told me since I was a kid that this would happen? But I was still a kid, and so it did happen. Why had she always been so patient with me anyway? I'm just a man carrying the poison of testosterone and blah 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 blah. She said I was on drugs if I really believed in Dogman, but it seemed more likely to her that this was me making some sort of ploy to try to get money out of her. She never explained the accusation, but she didn't need to. She was on a roll, and she was on a performance high. I tried to make things feel more normal. I asked when I was getting out and when I could go home. Well, after you made me feel unsafe with all your violent words about abandoning the family to live off-grid and use your white privilege to mock people of poverty by pretending you're one of them, I can't imagine you had any illusions about it rejoining the family proper. Please take your male rage elsewhere. So that's not an exact quote, but basically she wasn't letting me back home. I apologized, which would have worked in the past. This time, she took it as an admission of guilt and acted like she no longer felt any guilt herself about banning me from the family home, even though I was her eldest child. Mother wasn't always like that, but this was 2020, and she had no option but to stop thinking and to parrot whatever she was told to. Some of us can think and make our own decisions, it's true, but there are a lot fewer people like us, and a lot more people like my mother. It's not really our place to judge them. They can't help doing what they're told to do. And if you're missing someone who is now programmed to dislike you, take comfort in the awareness that this was not really a person who was ever there with you in a full sense mentally. You were either an obligation or a status symbol to them, sometimes interchangeably, but you were never going to be a real person to a person who isn't fully real. Most humans receive their ideas by plugging into the hive mind. Some of us are born with that connection broken, though, and so we have to find out things on our own and make new decisions in every moment. We aren't plugged into a pre-existing philosophy that makes all our decisions for us. That doesn't make us better than anyone else, though. Yes, it does mean we're more likely to discover new things that might help humanity, but it also makes us more likely to get hung up and strung up and taken out of commission because our discoveries are so scary to the villagers. Mother paid for my hospitalization, then gave me a check with a lump sum, writing a note on the check reading, "In return for going away." I thought about appealing to her humanity, but then I remembered who I was talking about. Her friends would actually applaud her cutting me out of the will, what with my toxic maleness and all that. She probably gets toasted as a hero for it. That's alright though. My mother doesn't know it, but I've been living in an old shack on the back of her land. It's cold, and the hunting is not great, especially in the winter. It's got great Wi-Fi though, and so I am researching the Dogman. In the spring, I'm going to start swimming in that deep swimming hole again. Every day I'm going to swim in there. All spring, all summer, however long it takes, till they come back. I want to return to the Dogman pack. I may have been treated like a dog and fed scraps, but I felt more respected than I ever could feel among my mother's family. That's the lesson I learned when I was captive of the Dogman clan. The Dogman spoke to us at length. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a teenager, I went on a retreat with a group of people who at the time I thought were a religious group, but I've since learned that they were technically a cult. I mean, they were pretty benign for a cult. They never made us drink the Kool-Aid or anything like that. In fact, they fell apart and reformed into a few different groups after the night when the Dogman showed up in our camp and spoke to us at length. A number of people I've told about this inform me that I must have been talking with a werewolf, or else a shaman, or a shapeshifter, who took a form like a werewolf. He did speak in a way that was similar to a Native American man that I knew at the time, but that man lived in my town, not out in the woods. He also wasn't covered in fur, and he didn't have tall, pointed dog ears on top of his head either. This character did. I don't think it was anyone I knew in disguise. Maybe it was someone with a similar accent or way of talking to my native friend. Maybe it really was a medicine man or shaman of some sort. But why did he choose to appear to us in such a strange and terrifying form? I mean, we didn't stay to listen to him because we wanted to. We stayed and listened because we were horrified by his presence, and we were literally too scared to run. At least sitting there around the campfire, we'd be able to see him if he made any moves to hurt anyone. Also, there were 5 of us and only 1 of him, so if we held together by the fire, we'd have a better chance if a conflict arose than if we split up and ran through the woods. Now, before the thing or man or spirit or whatever it was arrived, we were gathered around the campfire, and we were at the point in the night when we were telling scary stories to each other. This was not the entire group. It was one of the elders and 4 of us newbies. She had been teaching us basics of their philosophy, and now we were relaxing with toasted marshmallows and ghostly tales. We were feeling friendly and enjoying each other's company. And then suddenly, the person next to me gasped, and I looked up to see a man in a furry costume approaching us. At least that's what it looked like to me at first. This was the early 1990s, and I had not heard of furries or cosplay yet. So I'm sort of using modern words to describe what happened that night. To be as clear as possible, I thought it was a costume, but I don't mean to say I thought it was a member of this or that community. I thought it was a lone nut dressing that way to scare us. I stood up in alarm and confusion, unsure if I wanted to run or confront this weirdo coming over out of the blue in the dark. The guy held his hands up in front of himself as if to urge me to calm down. It also seemed to be to signal that he carried no weapon and meant no harm. For some reason it didn't make the hair on my arms go down though. Maybe it was the extreme length and weird pointiness of his fingers. Or it might have been the way his face jutted out into a long snout, like the face of a wolf or coyote or something. It could also have been his tall dog-like ears up on top of his head, which seemed to twitch and move on their own. This cosplay costume was certainly a sophisticated one. By that point, everyone was standing up and backing away a bit from the fire and the creature. While we had been seated around the flames, we were all on one side now, with him on the other. I had no idea what was going to happen next, but I did not expect it to be anything good. The guy sort of kneeled in this way on one knee, and he began to tell us about how he was picking up our teaching where it had been left off. He called our teacher by name, as though she knew about the fact that he was going to be arriving. She looked back at all of us in confusion, making it clear that she didn't know any more about what was going on than we did. So my mind next went to the theory that this was a psychotic, costumed person who had been stalking us, or at least our teacher, for quite a period of time before that night. My blood ran cold at the implications of that part of it. Whatever this guy was planning to do, it seemed he had been planning it for some time. The weird thing about the way he spoke was that his dog lips seemed to be pronouncing the words. They were far more flexible than a dog's mouth's lips should be, and also more flexible than a mask would have been. It was as if I were looking at a dog's mouth adapted to speaking human language. And as I stated earlier, pronouncing each word in an accent similar to that of my Native American acquaintance from my youth. I wish I knew what people's accent I'm referring to, but I grew up in Wisconsin, so I think that would narrow it down somewhat. Let's say he spoke in a Midwestern native accent. His teeth were not the long fangs you describe in a lot of the episodes on your channel. This guy's bridge work looked very human, just extended into a long snout. Most of the teeth were fairly short and blunted, like ours, with only a few that ended in sharp points. If this was a real animal, it was most likely an omnivore, like a human being. It didn't seem as though it could have been a costume, so it was either a real creature, or a shape-shifting medicine man, or some kind of holographic projection or a shared hallucination or something like that. I mean, I guess I would have to vote for number 1 or number 2. I think it was a real something. I just don't know exactly what I mean by that. I mean, it took up space and it was alive and it breathed air, in my opinion. I can't prove that, though. If it was an illusion, it was a masterful one. This individual referred to himself as Dogman and spoke to us each in turn, following no order that was apparent to me. I remember he called me by name, and he told me a story from my childhood, about 10 years prior to that night. He told me about something I had nearly forgotten myself, about a bully who beat me up in front of my own father. My dad said he was disgusted with me, so instead of breaking up the fight, he drove home. As a result, I got beat up worse. Then, I got laughed at by a bunch of kids and one teacher as I trudged home, where my father once again communicated his disappointment in me. You can sort of understand why I would block something like this out. As the Dogman told that story, the kids around me at the fire kinda snickered at me. But then that Dogman told me that he had been there on that day, and he had seen the entire thing. And so, he decided to heal the bully on my behalf. He sat there looking at me as though expecting a reaction. I didn't know what his words even meant. Healing the bully on my behalf. And so I didn't know how I should react. Thinking back on it, I had expected that kid to bully me more and more after he basically got encouraged to by my father. Instead, I hardly remember running into him at all after that. He didn't get into any trouble for what he'd done, and yet he didn't seem to bother me any more after it. He wasn't nice to me either, we just avoided each other. I hadn't thought too much about that until the Dogman said he'd healed my bully. This, I have to say, put me in a weird mood, and I joked that he should have healed my dad instead. The Dogman responded by asking me what my father did after that day. I thought about it, and what he did was he had one of his army buddies come over to our place on Saturdays, and then the two of them basically pushed me around a lot. This was their way of teaching me how to fight back. In the beginning, it was solely pushing me around, though. It took a long time before I started learning anything, but the Dogman was right. My father was no longer abandoning me in disgust. Now he was forcing me to get tougher, whether I liked it or not. Of course, I hated it, but in retrospect, what he did made my adult life a little bit less horrible. I never got as tough as him and his buddy, but I didn't get pushed around at school anymore. I'm a suspicious type of person, and so I sat there, trying to figure out how the Dogman really found out all that stuff about my childhood and my father, and so forth. I also wondered if this was actually part of the training of this group, or cult, to pretend to have a mystical spirit of the woods invade camp and tell stories that he should not be able to know. The thing is, this all could have been the result of spying into the family history of each of us new recruits. It seemed to me that it could be some kind of carnival trickery designed to dazzle and amaze us into becoming lifetime members of whatever it was they wanted us to join. Instead, though, the more I saw my fellows become amazed, the more suspicious I got. Yet no matter how much I wanted to think that this was some kind of scam, I couldn't figure out certain parts of it, like how the man had a dog head, or how that dog head was able to speak so clearly in English, and even with that specific accent. The fingers almost remind me now of the Grinch live-action movie that came out long after this event, with their length and furry nature. It looked like some kind of a fictional creature, but I was watching it move and breathe and listening to it speak. After bamboozling us with what were either genuine stories of how he had known each of us for a long time and had mitigated problems in our lives from afar, or else evidence of all of us being spied on, the Dogman moved to the miracles in front of our eyes portion of the show. He asked if he could have a marshmallow to put on the end of a long twig that he had picked up off the forest floor. Someone gave him one, and he poked the end of the stick through it. Just before putting the marshmallow into the fire to toast it, however, he pulled it back and reconsidered. "I don't think I want to toast a marshmallow," he said to nobody in particular. "I want to toast a nice big piece of salmon." Then he thrust the stick into the fire, and it sizzled and sparked so that I had to hold my hand in front of my face. The flame got too hot and too big, but only for a short moment. Then it died back down to normal. But we were all wiping soot off of ourselves and allowing our eyes to readjust to the darkness after having briefly been blinded. When I could see clearly again, I noticed that the werewolf wolfman thing was eating what sure looked like salmon off the end of his stick. I then noticed the smell of cooked salmon as well. Could that have been psychosomatic, or the result of suggestion? I didn't notice the smell until I saw the creature man eating what looked like a hunk of salmon. While eating, he casually informed us that any of these things he had done, both the things he described and the things he demonstrated before our eyes, were things that we could do as well. In fact, he leaned in over the fire to tell us that we were all going to have chances in our lives to do far greater things than he had ever or would ever get to do. Any ability or power he possessed was also possessed in equal or greater amounts by each of us. Then he belched. And some of us laughed. I was too freaked out to even realize that the belch was funny, I don't think. In retrospect, he must have been trying to lighten the mood. But on that night, I was being schooled by a hairy dogman, and I was not feeling very relaxed. Sometimes when I tell people about all of this, they react in awe, saying they wish they had super dogman powers or whatever. My personal reaction was not a positive one. I was feeling as though powers were being thrust upon me that would be accompanied by great responsibilities that I had never actually signed up for. I was a teenage guy. I wanted to get some spiritual guidance because I lacked that at home. And then I just wanted a career and a wife. I didn't want to be Spider-Man. I didn't want to have the power to alter people's life paths and so on, as this guy was suggesting. It was sensory overload, and it was mental overload. Too much to think about for me. It kind of still is. Even though I've told this story a million times, I can't tell you of one single day that I worked to hone any supposed powers. I'm too scared of the whole thing. If I have truly been given chances to do greater things than that dogman could do, I have not noticed when those chances came up. Maybe they'll happen tomorrow, I can't tell you. So then this weird magic show happened, where the dogman did one thing after another that made no sense at all. I don't know how he did them, but maybe a professional stage magician could have deciphered it. Like one time the dogman was talking to us from the other side of the campfire, and then someone screamed loudly behind us. When we turned around, the dogman was the one screaming, and we had all switched sides around the fire. He was somehow on the side we had been on, and we were somehow on the side he had been on, facing the other way. Now that still makes no sense to me, but somehow he pulled the trick off, like he was David Copperfield or something. He got up and ran toward the woods, returning soon after with a very small young tree that he had pulled up, along with a bunch of dirt. He ran back and replanted it at a small distance from the fire, and asked us who wanted to talk to the tree. It sort of angered me, and I told the guy that he was being illogical. I was still scared of him, but I think fear and anger are two sides of the same thing. So I was frozen in fear until suddenly I was raising my voice in anger. Illogic upsets me, and I told him so. The dogman looked at me with those weird eyes, and somehow, for the first time, I felt empathy and compassion from him. I don't know if he was genuinely projecting those qualities, or if he was somehow tricking me into feeling that, but I felt it. He told me that logic never leads to happiness, and gestured toward the tree. That same empathy I felt from him, I felt myself toward the tree. I patted its dirt down, and I gave it a little bit of my water. I didn't speak out loud, but I felt as though the tree and I were sharing a moment of communication. And of course, that's completely illogical. None of us had cell phones. This was the early 90s. One of my friends in my hometown had a father with a car phone, but that's about all I remember. However, there's one kid named Curtis had brought his dad's giant old VHS camcorder, and in the middle of our lessons, he got up and sneaked off to his tent to get the camera. He didn't come back for a long time, and for some reason, none of us seemed alarmed by that. The odd performance continued, until our teacher informed the dogman that we normal humans all needed to get to sleep. The dogman laughed and said something to the effect that now he was the one being taught. Standing and bowing, the dogman backed up into a darker place, and then just didn't seem to be there any longer. It wasn't just that you couldn't see him or hear him. It was also sort of like the very air itself felt different. There was also a kind of exciting buzz when he was there that suddenly was absent from that entire location. That's not to say that we didn't all buzz excitedly for some time after that, comparing our interpretations and theories about what we had just lived through. When we finally retired later that night, we noticed Curtis asleep in the larger tent, his arms wrapped around his dad's VHS camcorder. He had gone to get it, then fallen asleep, and missed the rest of the things that the dogman told us and showed us. So I left that cult group a little while afterward, but they were good for me in the short term, and they weren't jerks about letting me leave as some other groups might have been. In that sense, maybe they weren't a cult after all. I still have my suspicions, but our teacher that night always maintained her innocence of any involvement in what had happened. I personally can only guess as to what that was. I do know that one of the kids in my group went on to become quite successful. I friended him on social media, and he told me that everything the dogman had told us proved to be true. I didn't know what he meant by that, so I wrote back, asking him to elaborate. That was the last time I heard from him. I don't think he unfriended me, but we haven't had any more conversations. It seems my old buddy took the lessons more to heart than I did on the night when the dogman spoke to us at length. We sheltered a dogman in winter. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my late wife and I sheltered a dogman over a few winters in a part of Wisconsin very close to the Minnesota border. I saw the beast, bigger than any man, with my own eyes. My wife once saw 4 of the dog-headed upright walking beasts at one time when I wasn't there. This was a very long time ago, and I am no longer a young man, so I am dictating this to my 35-year-old grandson, who has promised me that he will edit it until it is coherent. My grandson is who alerted me to your channel, asking me if these stories aren't in fact about a kind of creature that my wife and I had to deal with way back before that young man was even born. It's a story we told sometimes at family gatherings, but we didn't call it a werewolf or anything like that. It was not magical or mystical to us. It was a very real problem. We didn't know that this was a controversial animal. We didn't realize that it didn't officially exist. Of course, I'm talking about what you call a dogman, but what my wife and I once called an extremely dangerous nuisance. I'm gonna retell you the stories as well as I can. To be honest, I remember these old events more clearly lately than I remember what I had for dinner last night. So I'll toss in all the details that are still up there in my memory. My wife Martha left us some years back, so I'll be flying solo on this one. What happened was that Martha and I decided we had saved up enough to get a summer vacation home. I couldn't really take much time off from work, so having a home in the country woods, close enough for me to drive to work from, was the way I relaxed a bit more during the summer months. I was putting in just as many hours of labor, but I was enjoying myself 10 times as hard at night and on the weekends. Some of the parties we threw out there were epic, even by modern standards. Although 99% of the time, it was just me and the missus out there alone. Now, this was the late 1950s, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm unsure what the real dates of this were. Let's say 57 or 58, maybe 59. There was a period after I got my promotion at work, and we got married in 1955, through 1962 when our first child magically appeared, when everything was the same all the time for us. It all blends together in my memory, and the only thing that sticks out as different is the saga of the Dogman. That's probably why I remember it so sharply, but I'm a bit vague on when exactly this all took place. At least I'm certain of the order of events. It was the spring of 1957, or probably 58, when I drove Martha out to the house to open it up for the summer. At the time, we had been told that the winters were too harsh to live in at that house, but about 17 or 18 years afterward, we actually had a Christmas gathering there. It could have been a year-round house, but whatever. In those days, it was our summer home. That meant we closed it up around Halloween, usually, and we opened it up around Easter. I'd head out with Martha to do the heavier work of cleaning and neatening up on a Saturday, and then I'd go back to work on Monday, while she'd stay out there and finish setting it all up and turning it into a home. Now, this place was in western Wisconsin, near the Fish Lake wildlife areas. It's really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, the streets do have street signs, but they aren't even paved. You drive down dirt roads that only stay roads because of the traffic. Parts of the road that get driven over less have bits of grass growing up out of them. But the advantage of living there was that it was usually just 2 hours or less, depending on traffic, to get into Minneapolis where I worked. Having come from Minnesota, I was not familiar with the Wisconsin werewolf or the Michigan dogman. I've heard since that the legends of both stretched back to before that era in the 1950s, but Martha and I had never heard of either back then. So when we drove out to open the house that spring and discovered a dogman inhabiting our basement, we really didn't know what to make of it. We had a number of encounters with this beast, but now I'm going to tell you about the first time we ever saw him, which was almost the last time for poor Martha. I was in the front of the house, opening windows and airing the place out. Martha was in the kitchen in the back, and she decided to open the door to the basement and move some supplies down there for storage. When she opened the kitchen door leading to the darkened steps to the cellar, though, she was met with a foul odor. Maybe the word stench is more appropriate. She told me she almost gagged at that first wave of bad air emerging from the basement, and then she thought she saw something moving around down there in the darkness. She had to climb down the first step in order to turn the basement lights on. But when she did, She looked down and saw a huge, hairy, dog-headed humanoid down there, staring right back at her. This was the most top-heavy creature God ever decided to give life to. I saw it myself later, as I will get to, and I'm telling you, the chest and shoulders were so massive that the shorter legs at the bottom made the creature look like he was going to topple over at any moment. But those two hind legs it stood on made up for their relatively brief length by being massively muscled, fantastically strong, and able to move lightning fast. Now in this case, when I'm calling the legs short, you should understand, his legs were about as tall as my legs, but its head would be way higher off the ground than my head. So all that height was made up of the midsection and torso, the chest and the belly, basically. On top of all that fur and muscle was the scariest looking dog head I'd ever seen. It wasn't exactly like a dog. It was sort of like a proto-dog. Like an earlier, more primitive, far too large design of what a wolf or dog could be. Its teeth were too large. Its chest was too wide. Its front legs had been designed more as arms. And the creature almost looked more like a human bodybuilder than he did a wolf or a canine. Honestly, standing a dog up creates a very different kind of an animal look, and an even scarier one, in my opinion. My wife Martha, in opening that basement door, had alarmed and upset the Dogman down there. When she turned on the lights and screamed, the Dogman blew up. In front of the house I heard Martha scream, and then a large dog barking and snarling and growling. I ran toward the back of the house, envisioning a horrible scene about to greet me. When I got back to the kitchen, I saw my wife on the floor, weeping. The basement door and the kitchen door were both open, but there was no dog anywhere to be seen. After I got her up and soothed her for a while, Martha was eventually able to tell me about this large dog that stood up like a man. She said she discovered him in the basement, and he charged up the stairs, pushing her out of his way in the process, resulting in her crashing to the kitchen linoleum. The animal man then escaped through the kitchen door, which I ran outside of as well, to look around. The ground was hard, and I'm not much of a tracker anyway, so I couldn't even guess as to which direction the beast had run in. Heading down to the basement, I discovered that the animal seemed to have spent the entire winter down there. I could see where he slept. I could see where he had eaten. I could see what he had eaten. And I had the wonderful job of cleaning it all up. No, I didn't save any of it for DNA, so don't even ask. This was the late 1950s. Nobody was saving poo for DNA in those days, just trust me. I don't even remember if I knew what DNA was back then. And like I mentioned before, neither Martha nor I knew that this was an unknown animal. We had not even heard of Bigfoot in those days, okay? I don't honestly remember Bigfoot becoming something in the culture until the late 60s or early 70s. I had heard of the Loch Ness Monster, but I had never heard the word cryptid. So I cleaned the basement out, and the creature did not return. Over the course of that summer, I had some contractors come out to look at the cellar and figure out how the thing got in and out. Initially we had no idea, but one of the guys discovered that if he crawled under the front porch of the house, there was in fact a window he could slide through into the basement. Now I don't understand what function that window would have ever served other than letting animals in, since the porch seems to have been original with the house, but that window seems to have been as well. At any rate, I had them brick the window up, and I hoped that would be the end of our winter-time squatter. The next spring it was my turn to open those basement doors and have the animal man down there freak out at me. This time I had gone out with my off-duty cop friend to the house and left Martha at home. I'm glad I did, too, because this time the dogman charged up those stairs at me so quickly that I could not get out of the way in time. I slammed backward, hard, onto the linoleum as the beast landed hard on top of me. This thing weighed more than any man, and with it on my chest, breathing was no longer an option. It barked loudly in my face, and I couldn't even smell its dog breath because I couldn't even sniff at the air. The creature was in a rage, bellowing and snarling at me, drooling on my face, baring its primeval teeth at me. And I began to wonder if I was about to find my life ending, or maybe something even worse. Maybe I was about to be hurt by this thing in such a bad way that I'd wish it had just ended me instead. There was nothing I could do, and the blackness was starting to creep in from the edges of my vision. I was about to pass out. That was when my off-duty cop friend burst in, firing his weapon loudly to scare the beast off of me. He told me later that the dogman stood up quickly and banged the back of his head so hard on the kitchen ceiling that it made a loud whacking sound. That's how tall this thing was when it was on its hind legs like that. The monster man looked as if he were about to attack my friend, according to him, and he was aiming to blow a new hole in the creature's face. When suddenly, the dogman had a change of heart. He pushed his way out through the back door and escaped once again. So we discovered that the bricks in the front window under the porch crawl space were still intact. It appeared to have scratch marks on it, as though someone or something had been trying to pull it apart, but it was very much still intact. The kitchen door, however, was broken. The creature had just used his strength to pull it open when it was supposed to push in. He had broken it around the doorknob and lock, and the door frame too. Now both were useless and needed to be replaced. This cost more to fix than the previous year, as I got high security doors for the front and back, and I replaced all the windows with ones that were supposed to be harder to break into. I also had very sturdy wooden shutters put on every window to make them even a little bit harder to break into. That entire summer I obsessed over getting the house ready to withstand its next attempted break-in by the dog-headed bear man that coming winter. I remember having various guys out to fix things, and them asking me what kind of an animal did this damage. I was honest with them that I wasn't really sure what it was. It was at least as large as a bear, but it didn't seem to be a bear. It was sort of a dog-headed bear, but with hands. None of them really gave me much of a reaction at the time. I mean, nobody said, "That's the Dogman," on the one hand, but nobody said there's no such thing as what you're describing on the other. Clearly there was something like that, and these men were looking at the damage it left in its wake. So ultimately the solution to the problem was actually thought up by my wife. She didn't stop me from shoring up our house's security, but she figured the Dogman was gonna come back to this area to look for shelter in the winter pretty much no matter what we did. And without us there to keep it out, it would eventually get back down to that basement. My wife's solution was not cheap, but it was less expensive than everything else I'd been doing, and it actually worked, so it was worth the price. Here's what she suggested. We needed to build a rudimentary shelter the same size as our basement on our land in the back of the house. She pointed out that the hollow in the back had some pockets or possibly sinkholes that were about 9 or 11 feet deep. If we covered that over with an easy-to-access entrance, the dog-headed bear man might choose it over our basement. Once we had created the shelter, I thought she might be a genius and this might actually work. On our last day out there, I went into town to a butcher's shop I'd seen, and I bought out a large quantity of the crappiest cuts he had. I explained it was to trap a wild animal, and that quantity was more important than quality in this case. I put most of the meat inside the entrance of the hovel we had created, hanging the rest from trees at a height that would hopefully only allow access to that creature, or maybe some normal kinds of bears. Then we left for the winter to our home in southeastern Minnesota, and we hoped our plan would work. Well, I hoped. My wife knew. She was so confident that the plan would work that she told me she would go out to the house first that next year, and she wouldn't need me to go with her. Of course, I forbade her from doing that. Husbands could forbid people in those days. Well, I mean, we thought we could forbid our wives. In this instance, Martha promised me that she wouldn't head out to the Dogman house until I could go with her. Then, she secretly drove up there alone while I was at work one Friday. It was there that she had the sighting of the multiple creatures. I think I mentioned that in the beginning of this. What happened was this. Martha drove up there and went right into the house with no fear, cleaning and dusting and airing it all out. Then she went into the basement to put some things down there and bring some other things up. She never had any doubt that the coast would be clear. And in fact, there were no invaders in the home on that day. In the later afternoon, I got a call at my office from her, which was something that usually meant an emergency had happened. This time she was not panicked, and she did not sound distressed. My heart was beating fast just because of how rarely she would call me at work, so I sort of demanded that she tell me if she was okay, and what was wrong. Martha insisted that nothing was wrong, and she seemed to think it was funny that I was reacting that way. She told me that she was out at the summer house, and she'd just seen the most remarkable thing. At this point, I felt like exploding. I didn't want to hear about what she'd seen. I wanted to know why she'd broken her promise to me and put herself at risk by heading out to that dangerous place without me and my cop friend first checking it out and clearing it for her. I didn't feel that this was a subject I could discuss at work, since the walls of my office were quite thin. And it was not a place or a time in history for people with complicated personal lives. Yes, it was almost the 60s, but it wasn't the 60s yet. This was a very buttoned-down time, and you didn't want to stand out in the crowd. You wanted to fit in. So I listened, gritting my teeth, as my wife told me about this event. We would throw sheets over the furniture before we left in the winter, because Martha found it easier to clean the dust out of the sheets than out of the furniture when we came back in the spring. So she was hanging those sheets she had washed out on the clothesline behind our house when she had the sighting of a lifetime. There, at the edge of the wood line, walking from her left to her right, in single file, were not one, but 4 of the dog-headed bear creature people. Of course, at this point, I was still listening to her, but I was already sorting through my belongings and getting ready to leave work early. I clearly had to get out to the summer home before something terrible happened. Martha said the one in the front of the parade was huge, and it was probably the one that knocked both of us down on those 2 different occasions. Behind him was a shorter one, which she took to be his wife, to use her terminology. Behind the wife were 2 shorter offspring. Martha saw the nuclear family and everything back then. She was just very family-centric, so I didn't immediately accept her interpretation of this scene. For all I knew, it was a gang of dogmen of various sizes moving in to make life for us unlivable at that house. I hopped in the car and drove out to the house to continue the conversation, and it was just about to start to get dark as I arrived. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed out to the hovel we had created. Sure enough, it did appear to have been lived in, and to me, it did look like multiple creatures had been living in that space. I did not see any of them around, however, and so I headed back to the house to hear the rest of Martha's story. She told me that the 2 dogmen taking up the rear of that parade were as tall as me, and I'm a 6-foot-tall man. If we assume the figure leading the pack to be the 11-foot one that bowled us both over in its escape attempts, then the one presumed to be the wife by Martha would have had to have been 7 or 8 feet tall. We argued with each other over the handling of it, and we both drove our separate cars back to the city to spend the night there and to prepare to open the house properly the next day. Well, I kept an eye on that Dogman hovel all summer, and it appeared to have been abandoned. All through the season, neither of us saw any evidence of their presence at all. By the next spring, we noticed that the hovel had not been used over that winter. This made no sense to me, but it made a lot of sense to my wife. He's a married man now, she explained in her unique way. He needed to go out and find a bigger home for his family. And I guess that must have been what happened, because I never heard about that beast again, except for when relatives and friends asked us to tell the old monster dog stories again. And I don't really blame them for asking to hear all those anecdotes over and over. After all, we sheltered a dogman in winter. I don't even want to do the math about where we'd be without our Kath. Please join us in thanking Kathy Barrickman for being today's executive producer. We thank Kathy with every episode, but today we're honoring her for being a top-tier member now for 2 years straight. That's 24 of your human months. Of course, Kathy is more than just an executive producer to us. The Dogman saved my family. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a Dogman story that I could tell you one way in about 2 minutes, but that version has no emotional impact. To tell it to you the proper way, well, I better go back to the very beginning and inform you about my little pet husky Malamute dog that I named Morley, after this weird old dude that my father used to watch on TV. Don't worry, the Dogman story I have to tell isn't just seeing the creature walk across the road in the fog or something like that. I guarantee you this is a story that you have never heard before, because nobody in my family ever told it before. It happened to me, my wife, and my 2 kids, who are both under internet age and who I'm mostly going to leave out of this. I did consult with my wife before writing this email in order to make sure that my descriptions match what she saw as well. Although this is a pretty terrifying encounter, it took a surprising turn. That's not to say that I'm about to tell you a good time fairy tale. If my own kids hadn't had to live through this, I would shield them from this narrative. If you frighten easily, then you might want to skip the rest of this story entirely. Although if you scared easily, you probably wouldn't be on this channel to start with. So I had an Alaskan Malamute Husky dog when I was a kid named Morley, and he was my best friend. We found him in the backyard, and so we put out a food bowl, and he became our dog. Mostly he preferred to sleep outside, even in the cold, and he always remained at least partially wild. When he would on occasion come into the house, he was always on his best behavior. This made me wonder if he was an escaped pet, but my dad always told me he was wild. He's wild, but he's smart. That was how my dad used to put it. We tried putting a collar on him, but we would find the collar on the grass in the middle of the yard. Somehow he would manage to take it off of himself. There was no way to chain him up, and since he could leap our fences, there was no way to keep him on our property. We tried to bring him to the vet once, but gave up quickly, so I'm not sure you can exactly call him our dog. However, we sure bought him a lot of dog food, and chewy toys and things of that nature, which were strewn around his yard. For all I know, he had several families feeding him, because he was a really smart fellow. He didn't just take, though, and this is the reason I have to tell you about him, before I can get into the Dogman story proper. When I was a kid, I was tall, but I was uncoordinated and gangly. Even now, coordination is an issue with me. I took up studying guitar to force myself to do one thing with my left hand and another with my right. I used to trip over my own feet once or twice every month. I was a disaster. I go to a gym and do specific exercises to mitigate my shortcomings in this area. But back then, it made me a target of bullies. One time, I was walking home from school, and 3 kids who did not live in my neighborhood were following me, taunting me with threats, and making me feel terrified. I really didn't want them to know where I lived, as they were telling me how bad they were going to make life for me and my parents, both. I was just a kid. I wanted to cry. when one of the bullies moved past taunts to violence, shoving me down onto the sidewalk. I curled into a ball and prepared to get beaten up. After a few seconds, I realized nobody was hurting me. I was hearing people crying out in pain. Disoriented, I sat up and saw Morley tearing one kid's jacket off his body, bite by bite. The other two bullies abandoned that one and were running back the way they came. The boy under my feet was screaming for me to help him. His voice was higher pitched than a girl. I asked him what he was going to do for me if I saved him from the dog, and he cursed at me, a whole bunch of nasty words that I wasn't allowed to say myself. So I shrugged my shoulders, kicked the kid in the neck just very lightly, and motioned to Morley. "Sick him here, Morley. Get him in the throat." I heard that kid screaming, and I heard Morley having a great time as I walked the rest of the way home. Don't worry, the kid survived. Morley wasn't a man-eater, and those bullies gave me a wide space from then on. They never told anyone that my dog attacked them. And really, was Morley my dog anyway? He came and went as he pleased. I didn't ask him to attack those jerks. He made that decision on his own. Even if I had told him to stop, do you think he would have? He was a force of nature. And he was my best friend. I jotted down notes before writing this email, and I actually listed out a few more times that Morley saved my life. Going over them now, though, I realized that in all those cases he basically just showed up, looking mean and growly. And then I got left alone. He only actually had to do something to those bullies that one time, and then his reputation was sealed, that nobody would dare mess with him, or me. After that, I used to call Morley a werewolf and a wolfman, because sometimes he would stand up on his hind legs and hug me. He started off taller than me, and we both grew until I was about equal in height to him by the time I had to go away to college. He passed away the week before I left for my dorm room, and it was the saddest day of my life. He was more special than any human I had met. Knowing him was like having a superhero for a friend. It almost seemed like he chose his time to leave us, as my childhood officially ended on that terrible day. There was no looking back. I was now going to have to take care of myself. My superhero friend, he had left in a physical sense, but I had internalized much of Morley's attitudes and personality over the years. When I encountered bullies in college, I found their weaknesses and I managed to cope with relatively little conflict. My internal mentor was that husky Malamute superhero dog that I had once known. I would say that I followed my own internal canine Mr. Miyagi's advice for years, and it never steered me wrong. I ended up happily married with 2 beautiful children. I earned enough that my wife was able to retire to take care of the family, and we have no complaints. I feel like I could never have gotten where I am on my own. It was only because of the examples set by my friend, who wasn't even a human being, but was wiser and more mature than most of us. During the pandemic, we were being advised to cover our children's faces up and then put them on a Zoom call instead of sending them to school. Whitney and I decided to buy a trailer, a Winnebago, that the 4 of us could live out of, and then hit the road. We'd homeschool our kids, but our home would be a different part of the country every night. We'd give them a real education in real time in a real place. Rather than locking down, we opened up, both our lives and the kids' minds. We started off driving south from the suburb of Cleveland that we live in, and by the winter, we found ourselves in Johnstown, PA. It's a very working-class place, and my wife's very working-class uncle prepared a fantastic lunch for all of us when we dropped in for a visit. He invited us to sleep over, but we were hoping to get down to the Laurel Ridge State Park, which is a bit to the southwest, in order to camp out and spend the night in our trailer. Although we did eventually get sick of the cramped quarters, That was still early enough in our extended road trip that sleeping in the camper was more fun than sleeping anywhere else, especially for the kids. So off we went, driving toward the camping park as snow started falling all around us. At first, it was so beautiful and serene, even the kids quieted down to watch the snow fall. We were driving on Route 271 through Pennsylvania, which is really in the middle of nowhere. I derived such great joy from that knowledge, too. There we were, the entire family, outside, experiencing life, instead of being locked inside in the dark, smelling our own farts. It was so exhilarating and freeing. And then, in the next second, I saw what I immediately recognized as a mythical beast, a Pennsylvania Dogman, running out onto the slippery road and skidding in front of our speeding camper. There was no way for me to have stopped that Winnebago, even if the road had been dry. But it was not. I did hit the brakes, but then the huge, heavy vehicle, containing my family and everything we held dear, hydroplaned and slid down the 2-lane highway, swerving back and forth. I tried to force our momentum to slow, and I felt the camper tip first left, then right. If we lost balance and tipped over, that might be the end of all of us. The creature in question stepped out onto the road toward my left, so I chose to turn right and try to drive off the road and around him. As I did so, another man-sized but canine-headed creature walked out in front of the vehicle. No matter what I did, I was going to hit something. So I chose to turn even further right and hope that one or more of the trees at the edge of the woods would arrest our fall down the hill without damaging the trailer or us too badly. In fact, I sort of did succeed in that sense. It's just that the vehicle had tipped maybe 20 or 25 degrees to the right, and the only thing keeping us from tipping further and rolling down the hill was one or two of the bigger trees out there. I could already hear them cracking, and a sense of panic set in. What do you do in this situation? I felt fully alert and ready to do whatever was necessary, but I did not know what driving maneuver would get me out of this one. I decided to try to turn left and drive forward, but when I turned the wheel just a little bit, the trailer slid just a little bit on the cold, wet ground, making a sound that reminded me more of an elephant in pain than anything made of steel and glass. My wife shouted in panic that we were all going to have our stories ended that night, and then our kids, of course, erupted in crying and screaming. If I was having trouble thinking before, this chaos made me feel completely panicked. My hands shook, and I felt useless. Everything that I had always remembered, that I had learned from my canine friend, all of it was gone, and I was pathetic and frightened, unable to save my own family. Outside, one of the monsters walked in my direction, and I became so scared that I almost felt like I was going to lose control of my limbs and breathing. He was a big man-like monster of a wolfman, swaggering over to me more than walking. The odd thing is, when I noticed that, it sorta calmed me. He wasn't acting like a freak. He wasn't behaving in a manic way, which I was. He seemed a lot calmer than me. Then, the Dogman leaped up a bit and grabbed at my window, which was leaning over to the right. I screamed, thinking he was trying to get in, and I moved further to my right. That caused the entire vehicle to slide just a little bit more on the road, leaving us by then probably 30 degrees to the right of where we wanted to be. Everyone was crying, but I was doing mine silently. I could see the dog-headed men moving around outside, and I wondered what they were doing. It seemed as though they had some primitive form of communication, and that they were working out a plan. Were they going to remove one or two of the trees, causing us to crash down the hill? Then they'd only need a can opener to dine on me and my loved ones, not to mention whatever food we had in there, which a dogman might like. I heard the dogman moving around on that exact side, the side of the forest, the side we were tipping over onto. Were they doing what I thought they were doing? I could hear branches and even tree trunks snapping and cracking all the time since this started. Was it happening more or less since they went over there? I couldn't really tell. Multiple bumping noises hit the camper from the side of the woods, and we all shrieked in horror. My wife looked out that side and told me all the hairy monster men who were pushing on the trailer rhythmically. We started to sway back and forth, a little left, a little right, a little more left, and so on, until all of a sudden, ba-bam, we had all four wheels on the ground and I hit go on the gas pedal. We rolled right back up onto flat ground, my front end sticking out a bit into the lane on the road. The kids cheered, and my wife openly wept. I didn't drive away. I needed to catch my breath, and I hoped the dogman didn't save us, just to eat us. I was too emotional to drive for a minute, and I sat there gasping for air and trying to calm down as the big, swaggering, hairy monster dog walked back over to me. He looked at me with this really weird but very familiar expression on his face. My old dog Morley used to make that face, and I realized this dog looked like a Malamute and Husky mix also, except that neither Malamutes nor Huskies are able to stand up on their hind legs and walk around like a badass action movie star. And then this feral, carnivorous, alpha male dogman walked over closer to me, licked me on the face as my family screamed. My wife was babbling about how now that monster had the taste of man on his tongue, and it was our responsibility to put him down before he ate everyone else in the state. I was trying to block her out and understand what was actually happening. The dogman was moving his head to the side in a really strange way over and over again as he looked at me. That was what Morley used to do when he wanted me to scratch him behind the ear. Now, if you ever think a wild predator is asking you to scratch it behind the ear, I'd advise you not to do what I did next, especially if you're the only financial support for your family. Then don't repeat what I did. But I was so wrapped up in that moment, I did reach out of the car, which caused several of the dogmen to adopt hostile posturing and begin growling loud enough to be heard inside the Winnebago. Well, until my wife started shouting something at me, I don't remember what. At any rate, he loved the ear rub. I did it for a while, and he moved to different positions and pushed hard, making my arm feel like he was going to break it off. The other upright canines appeared fidgety and uncomfortable through this, but they weren't growling anymore. I finally got all the big creature's itchy spots, and he dropped to the ground and scratched himself just a little bit more. The same way Morley always used to finish our ear-rubbing rituals. Satisfied, the big Duke Dogman ran on all fours into the woods on the other side of Route 271 in Appalachia, and the other dogs, yipping loudly in excitement, followed him enthusiastically. The dogmen were gone, but we are still to this day cataloging all the ways in which that encounter changed our lives. With my wife, of course, it's all bad news. She won't allow the children out after dark. She won't allow herself to calm down. She won't allow me a moment's peace. For me and the kids, though, this has been a world and eye-opening experience. Now, the two of them are into Dogman and monster stories. They tell me stuff about cryptids that I didn't even know. They're going to be experts before long, and I'm proud of them. Of course, none of the rest of my family can ever understand the deep and emotional impact this experience had on me. Do I think it was the reincarnation, at least in some sense, of my old dog Morley that came and saved us? While I don't understand the world well enough to say it couldn't have been him, I do try to find more mainstream explanations. Like, maybe Morley and this Dogman behaved similarly because they had similarity in breeding. Of course, that's making the huge leap to assume that dogmen which look like husky canines actually have husky blood, DNA, and instincts. Another giant-sized assumption is that asking for your ear to be scratched by tilting your head to the side repeatedly would even be an instinct. It seems more to me like learned behavior. Wouldn't you need to have had your ear rubbed before in order to be asking for it to happen again? And who would have rubbed the ear of a dog-headed furry version of a young Schwarzenegger except a complete idiot like me? If I wasn't rubbing the ear of a dogman who remembered or knew of my old best friend Morley, then he must have known in some other way that humans are good at rubbing a canine behind the ear. He untilted our vehicle. He saved our lives. Then, as a reward, he wanted me to help stop his ear from itching. I actually went and found a therapist to talk to about all of this. My wife wouldn't stop raising her voice and getting me very unhappy. I needed to get perspective and understand where she had reason to shout and where she might be being unreasonable. This therapist assured me that it didn't really matter too much if the Dogman was the literal reincarnation of my best friend or if it was all just a remarkable assemblage of coincidences. What did matter was that, at least in a figurative sense, Morley came back and saved my butt one more time. She asked me how I felt about that. I had to admit, it felt great. My wife, of course, told me that I should keep seeing the therapist forever, but I didn't have a problem with what happened anymore, so I didn't feel the need to talk anymore about it. My wife likes unnecessary drama. I think it makes her feel comfortable in between actual drama, which of course she can't stand. The Dogman story was actual drama, and it helped me resolve issues from my childhood. So to her, that means I need a shrink, and that I'm making everything about me, and that I'm setting a bad example for the kids by encouraging their interest in cryptozoology. She keeps trying to make everything more complicated than it needs to be. This was not a complicated story. In fact, I can reduce it to one line, and that line is: the Dogman saved my family.
If you want a coloring book full of monstrous delight, then give this a look. It'll give you a fright. Scary stories coloring book, werewolf coloring book. And just to make your mind explode, it's a digital download. All it costs is $2.09, and then you will be feeling fine. Coloring monsters today, hey, it's a coloring book, hooray. Okay, link is in the description.
Well, we made it all the way to number 1. You've probably seen this one before. This is the most viewed story on our channel. It's become iconic with some people. They really identify with it. People tell me this is the story they wish happened to them. So get your popcorn ready. It's a short one, but it's a good one. Dogman sat down right next to me. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was salmon fishing at the edge of Lake Huron this past August. I was doing it for food because I had lost my job due to evil people running this planet. I really needed that fish for survival reasons, but as it would turn out, I would not be the one eating that salmon. That was just one result of the fact that Dogman sat down right next to me. You see, I had finally gotten some good luck to come my way, and I'd found a perfect little spot to fish in on the lake on that bright and sunny morning. I had been doing well since before the sun was up in the sky. and I was gathering quite a collection of salmon to be cleaning once I headed back at lunchtime. An entire cooler, a third full up with fish already, and I still had hope for another good hour of fishing to go. With each new salmon caught, my mood grew brighter, and I began to remember what it felt like to be hopeful for the future. So I heard and felt the approach of the giant creature long before I turned around and looked at him. I swear, I thought it was an extremely heavy-set fellow coming up behind me, the way I heard that wood from the pier I was sitting on the end of groaning. I knew it was struggling to keep its boards from snapping in two under the weight of this taller-than-tall, man-like thing. I was wondering why this guy was coming up behind me and how he was going to bother me, but I wasn't feeling threatened until the second I turned my head to acknowledge the presence of my intruder, and I found myself staring into the glowing, supernatural-looking eyes of the Dogman. I nearly jumped into the water and swam away, and with the way things turned out, that might have been as smart a decision as any other choice I could have made in that moment. I have to explain something that I'd better be careful about. Some people are sensitive about their appearance, and so you can't just be throwing words like ugly around carelessly. It can really hurt someone's feelings if they get called a word like that. And the worst part of that is that we all always change how we look as we grow up and grow old. We can only have so much influence on how we look, and the rest is decided by fate and by time. I've been called ugly, and I've used the word on others, and it never led to anything good or beneficial. I try never to resort to such language, and if I had children, I would not allow them to call other people ugly. That all having been said, the Dogman? He is an ugly SOB. He doesn't have anything pretty or nice about him. He's just born to be bad, and I don't mean that in the cool sense. Dogman was put on Earth to be gross. Dogman was given his chance to live in order to be disliked by anyone or anything with the slightest decency inside of them. The Dogman isn't just an ugly old cuss. He's ugly from the inside on out. Even if you gave him a bath and stuck his fur in rollers, you could never do anything to help him be less ugly or less nasty. So imagine you were me, and you were minding your own business fishing, and then along comes this ugly as sin, fur-covered man thing, standing maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and smelling like the inside of a dead rabbit that's been sitting in the sun all day. He walks out to the end of the pier where I'm sitting, and you can see the wood bending under him. I wonder what he's gonna do, but I don't move a muscle. I sit there holding my fishing rod, so shocked that I have to remind myself even to breathe, okay? I was wondering what he was gonna do, and I guess he was wondering the same thing because we both were just there for a while, neither of us doing anything. There were flies buzzing around his behind, which was less than a foot above my head. As a consequence, sometimes I had his butt bugs buzzing around my face. I kept trying to swat them away without making any sudden movements that might agitate the Dogman. I began wondering if the uncomfortable silence was going to end with the creature taking a bite out of the top of my head. And I have to admit, that was the longest 10 or 20 seconds of my life. Then bam, the Dogman sort of let his feet slip out from under him, and I went bouncing way up in the air. His giant Dogman butt slammed down onto the wooden boards that I was sitting on, basically turning the pier into a teeter-totter. I reached around to stop my cooler full of fish from bouncing off the pier, and then I returned to my original seated position, terrified that I now had a huge, hairy, smelly monster hanging out while I fished for my lunch and dinner. I unexpectedly got a bite on my line, and I actually wondered what I should do. Sense memory took over, and I started to do what I'm good at, which is reeling in even the toughest to catch fish. The Dogman seemed interested, but not too interested, so I just went ahead and brought that fish on in. With it dangling on the end of my line in front of the two of us, I wondered what would happen next. Would the dogman allow me to put the fish in my cooler? What would happen after he saw all those other fish in the cooler? How long had the dogman been observing me anyway? Maybe he already knew that my cooler was half full of salmon. I was in a situation where my opponent not only had a distinct physical advantage over me, but he literally had more information than I did as well. If I was wondering what to do, the dogman solved the problem for me. He stared at the dangling fish and rubbed his flea-infested head on my shoulder. I felt like I wanted to be sick, but the creature was only getting started. Next, he affectionately licked me from my neck to my chin and up over my right ear, getting rancid-smelling dog slobber all over me. It was the single most nauseating thing I've ever had happen, but it could have been oh so much worse if the creature had decided to use its teeth or its claws to take that fish from me. Not knowing what else to do, I swung the salmon over where the dogman could grab it, which he did in a surprisingly fierce manner, acting as though he were starving. The fish was being torn to shreds by his teeth before it was separated from my line. I got up and ran, and I'll tell you exactly why I did, too. I was afraid of what was going to happen if and when that dogman bit into my lure. That was going to release an entire world of hurt on that big boy, and I didn't want to be anywhere around while he tried to get that little sharp metal fishing lure out of his gums. I ran down the pier while that dogman had that salmon down at the end. I hid behind a tree, watching to see if he would leave my cooler of fish alone. But such was not to be. The monster smacked the top off that cooler and stuck its massive dinosaur-sized dog head down inside. He ate those fish alive like sushi, and he made a big mess of it, too. I could tell there wasn't going to be anything edible in the cooler by the time that big monster was done with it, so I took a walk to the supermarket to get me some spaghetti to have for my lunch and dinner. I went back for my cooler later after the dogman was gone, and I washed it out in the lake. He hadn't really damaged it, but it was nasty. I suppose that if the creature had actually damaged the cooler with his teeth, that would have made the thing more valuable. I don't know if there are any officially recognized dogman teeth markings. The information that could be derived from such a thing might prove truly valuable in helping to identify what this animal actually is. Unfortunately, the only evidence that dogman left behind of his visit was my empty, growling belly. And that's all I've got left from the time that dogman sat down right next to me. Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.